Pursuant to order of reference of Wednesday, September 23, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study of Canada-China relations. Il s'agit d'une réunion hybride.
This is a hybrid reunion pursuant to the motion adopted by the House on January 25, 2021. Before we go to the witnesses, I'd like to advise members of the committee that Mr. Ian Stewart, President of the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Dr. Guillaume Poliquin, Vice President by interim of the National Microbiology Laboratory, have confirmed their appearance before the committee for Monday, May 10th, 2021.
Indicated they are negotiating with the Translation Bureau and will do their best to expedite translation. And now, turning to our witnesses, I'd like to welcome as individuals Lynette H. Ong, Associate Professor of Political Science, Monk's School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, as well as Richard Fadden. Thank you both for being here. Let's open the floor for opening remarks with Ms. Ong. Please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Chairman Reagan, Vice Chairs, distinguished members of the Special Committee, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for the generous invitation to testify before the committee today for a second time. Given that today's topic on foreign interference, I would like to start with some definitional issues. What constitutes foreign interference, and how do we differentiate foreign influence from foreign interference? A country can exert influence on another country through the use of carrots, such as financial aid and concessional loans, sticks, such as economic sanctions, and persuasion, such as propaganda or disinformation campaign. Democracies have a more pluralistic and open society and are more tolerant of foreign influence. And conversely, autocracies are less tolerant because policy contestation tend to take place between factions of the ruling elites rather than in the public realm. And when does foreign influence become foreign interference? Foreign interference refers to the gray zone of domestic security. The terms have been used to describe it range from what are covert and deceptive to malicious and manipulative. And I think the scope of what foreign interference laws cover also differ among countries. Therefore, the distinction between legitimate foreign influence, as every country aims to pursue with its public diplomacy, and foreign interference is not clear-cut. And I think it should be recognized that they exist along a continuum rather than in binary terms. Now, I would like to spend some time speaking about United Front work. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP's United Front strategy is premised on the idea of uniting lesser enemies to defeat greater ones. The strategy proved highly successful in the Civil War that brought the CCP to power in 1949 by enabling it to recruit non-Communist Party holders, business leaders, and local communities to undermine the Kuomintang government. While much of the United Front work was inward-facing in the past, its prominence has been reinvigorated and scope expanded since 2015. In the same year as the term limits for the Chinese president was abolished, the government departments in charge of ethnic affairs, religion, and overseas Chinese affairs were subsumed within the party's United Front Work Departments. Since then, the United Front Work Department's foreign-facing operations are carried out by overseas Chinese, with the party's cooptation of ethnic Chinese individuals and communities living outside China, and Chinese organizations based overseas. The key United Front groups include peak organizations, such as the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference that brings together the non-CCP social elites domestically. In overseas, it includes the Chinese Overseas Friendship Association, the All China Federation of Returned Overseas Chinese, Chinese Students and Scholars Association, and numerous overseas Chinese friendship and hometown associations. By co-opting these organizations under the umbrella of the United Front work, the party seeks to shape the narrative and extends its influence overseas. But this begs the question of whether activities of these organizations are instances of foreign influence, such as attempts to project China's soft power overseas, or do they amount to foreign interference? And due to the covert nature of some of these activities, it makes more challenging for a fair and impartial assessment. And I think there's a lack of rigorous academic studies on the subject of the United Front work. Being part of the United Front networks does not automatically imply that individuals or organizations are the CCP's local agents to carry out foreign interference, even though they are part of the umbrella. And I think it is important also to recognize that the diasporas are not passive or apolitical agents of their home governments. In general, the diasporas have agencies and incentives of their own. In Canada's context, it is also crucial to recognize that the Chinese diasporas is far from being a homogeneous community, and their allegiance to the Chinese government or the CCP should not be automatically assumed. In 2018, okay, I've got 2 more pages to go. Can I go to my recommendations? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute.
Sorry, if you could listen, we provided 5 minutes. Hopefully the questions that are asked will draw out more of this from you, if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Mr. Fadden, over to you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be before you this afternoon. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you didn't vet my comments and provide a little context to the issue as opposed to speaking in great detail about the specific topic of foreign interference. I think it's important when we look at this Chinese practice, along with a raft of others, to think of the Chinese as our strategic adversaries. And what I'd like to talk about more than anything is that what this should mean for Canada if we accept that. I think as a condition precedent to dealing effectively with the Chinese on foreign interference, on anything else, we have to accept that they have a coordinated and a centralized policy and activity development program that enables them to use all of the tools that they have at their disposal: foreign, defense, security, and trade policy. And my meta message this afternoon is that if we are going to deal effectively with the Chinese, we have to do the same. We cannot look at foreign interference in isolation from trade activity or diplomatic initiatives in the Far East or Indochina. We have to have a coordinated activity. So a couple of meta points, if I may. First, I think we need to be realistic. China is the second most powerful country on the planet, and we're a middle power amongst many. Except when our sovereignty is directly impacted, I'm not sure there's a great deal that we can do alone to affect how the Chinese are going to treat their objectives, how they're going to carry out their objectives. If we are to have an impact on the Chinese, we must use every multilateral tool at our disposal. If the UN doesn't work, we should try the Five Eyes, the G7, and the margins of NATO. They all provide many opportunities for ministers and officials to exchange views and coordinate action. Let me touch upon what we should do when our sovereignty is directly affected by Chinese action. We need to recognize it, first of all, and develop some sort of consensus on what that is. And when it's not, we cannot stop it, and when it is not stopped, we need to take some action. Foreign influence is an activity that comes to mind. By any definition, this is unacceptable and is an assault on our sovereignty and a threat to our citizens. There's no reason why we cannot discuss this common problem. This is a common problem shared by many of our allies, and coordinate any pushback. When the Chinese activity is more indirect, too many Chinese students in universities, the extent of Chinese grants to research in areas sensitive to our national security, we need to do something in this area as well. Because they affect these other areas, other than our national security interest, they're more difficult to deal with, but they cannot be ignored in the face of control exercised by the Chinese state. Coming back to my effort at setting out a meta point, I submit that Canada cannot effectively deal with organized and centrally controlled Chinese activity without itself being organized and coordinated. I mean that our response needs to be whole of government at the level of the government of Canada and national at the level of the government of the country. By whole of government, I mean our reaction to unacceptable Chinese behavior can't just be limited to CSIS, CSE, and occasionally DND and GAC, but rather must encompass all elements of the Government of Canada. ISED and natural resources come to mind. By national, I mean that the responsibilities of the federal government for protecting our sovereignty and the control it has over our border means that it entails federal governmental activity throughout the private sector, civil society, and indeed in some matters potentially affecting the province. I stress again, we're not going to be able to deal with foreign influence or any other acceptable Chinese activity unless we admit we have a problem and that we coordinate it internally and with our closest allies. This is not necessarily very easy, and it's not easy for any number of reasons, but I just want to flag one, which is that not all Chinese citizens and not all Chinese activities are undertaking activities that are harmful to Canada. So distinguishing the kinds of activities that Professor Ong talked about and those other activities that are perfectly fine is a great deal more difficult than it sounds on the surface. And the only way we're going to do this is if we talk about it, we articulate what we consider to be unacceptable, and ideally come up with standards that are very similar across our allies. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Mr. Chair, you're still on mute.
Excusez-moi, I'm very sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Fadden and Ms. Ong. Et maintenant, on va commencer avec le premier tour.
We'll start with the first round of questions. Mr. Paulus, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And hello, thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Fadden, this may seem simple as a question, but if we look at the evaluation of threats when talking to China, economic, national security, and defense, can you tell me what the level of threat is from 1 to 10?
Like you, I go through this all the time. My apologies. Je pense que je place.
I think that I would place the level of threat near 8. That's particularly the case because Chinese authorities are completely determined to advance their objectives, no matter what we think. What particularly worries me is that are they ready to use almost any method to advance their objective? That's something we can't do here in Canada or elsewhere in the world in general. Question, there is no limits, there's no regulation for them. At the worst, they can do what they want. We have questions on some things already covered by the committee. For example, we had Mr. Junot here recently. He said there was a high number of diplomats here in Canada. What do you think of what he has to say about that? Answer, I'd say that there are a few more Chinese diplomats than need be here in Canada, but large countries tend to have very large embassies. It's not necessarily the number of people here in Canada from China, but what they're doing. What are their functions? I think that's what we should perhaps pay attention to. An embassy member taking care of consular or cultural questions is fine, but I'd say there are some who are simply members of Chinese public security, and the number of those diplomats should be reduced. It's not the overall number. Question, then you're saying about the actual functions that we need to examine. We need to ask questions about why people from public security in China are on our territory. Last year, during the pandemic, there was a whole issue with the CAN-Sino company and vaccines. The contract was abandoned. One witness said that China was playing political games. Do you have a better idea of exactly what political games China was playing with this CAN-Sino contract? Answer. Honestly, I won't be able to answer you. I don't know the details of this contract. Fine, thank you. Ms. Ong mentioned this, but I'll ask you, what do you think of Canada's approach to the 1,000 Talents program, among others? Answer. I think that we should begin by accepting that we have a problem. One problem that we have here in Canada, opinions have changed in recent months. There is no consensus. And as long as we don't have a consensus about these types of activities, it's very difficult for national security services to effectively deal with this type of activity. We're very clear in Canada and among our allies that this type of activity is not acceptable. What we do need to do, I think, is increase the resources assigned to national security agencies here in Canada. We give them a very broad mandate, but we don't necessarily assign the resources they need. A few minutes ago, it was said that there are no restrictions on Chinese activities. And another advantage that they have is almost unlimited resources. If we want to deal with them, we need to act. Question. I remember you came to testify at the Public Security Committee on Bill C-59 a few years ago. This was a question of cybersecurity. Recently, with COVID, Canada should become better equipped to deal with these threats. Answer. Yes. I hope to have another answer, but I think that the general environment, the general global digital environment is so active and so dangerous that indeed Canada has to have the powers to fight these actively. We need a proper legislative framework, but something needs to be done. Last question. I'm running out of time. Why is it that Canada should be frightened? Is it economic factors that we should be worried about, or are there other issues? Answer. I think that we should, yes, be worried about economic issues. That's the big fear. It's no secret that Canadian secrets are stolen. That costs us quite a bit of money every year, and that's difficult to deal with.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Paulus.
Thank you, Mr. Paulus. We'll continue with Mr. Lightbound. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our two witnesses. My questions are for Mr. Fadden to begin with. Thank you for your testimony and for your service as well. I'd like to go back in time 10 years to about 2010. You said that many politicians and government officials, as well as ministers, were under foreign influence, who were carrying foreign influence, and that the foreign espionage had entered Canadian circles, elite circles. You were talking about China in particular. The Minister of Public Security did not like what you had to say. Mr. Junot was with us a few weeks ago. He said that you were severely reprimanded by the government at the time. You were thrown under the bus by Prime Minister Harper's bureau at that time. Has this changed? Has the government now taken these threats seriously? Has it increased its way of dealing with the threats that you mentioned, that is foreign interference? Answer. I think that both within the government, opinions have changed. I use the English expression.
Influence. Et je pense que ça a été un peu
they had a certain measure of influence. I think that was exaggerated. Perhaps it was understood that they controlled senior civil servants, but that wasn't the case. I think now it's generally accepted that what I was saying was indeed the case, and that this type of activity needed to be taken seriously. In recent years, many of your colleagues, current and former, told me that I was right and that we had to be a little bit more honest back then. CSIS, for example, now has resources to deal with this, or has more resources, but they're very subtle, these activities. There's no smoking gun, as we say. With our allies, however, it's possible for us to counter this type of foreign influence, whether it comes from China or another country. The great difficulty that we have in Canada is that the general public has trouble understanding that we're threatened. We feel very comfortable here in North America. We've got 3 oceans. We've got a border with the U.S. Sometimes you have to face a crisis before you truly understand there's a problem. So we're somewhat limited within the national security agencies with regard to what we can do. Question, with regard to how things have changed in attitude and awareness raising in Canada of this threat, and China specifically. In 2010, 2011, in your report as head of the CSIS, you said there was competition economically, strategically as well. You didn't mention China specifically, however, in your report. Why did you not do so? We've seen with Mr. Vigneault that China has indeed been named, so this has changed. And was it indeed China that you were referring to back then? Answer. I think the main reason was that there was not really a consensus at the time within the Five Eyes group, nor within our allies. Countries had not yet formally declared that they were having trouble with one country in particular. That would have been difficult to do. So we didn't name China, but I think it was understood. People read between the lines when they read the report. It's very difficult to name a particular country if you can't raise specific examples, and that's tricky in this field. Last question, with the time that I have. Could you tell us about the Five Eyes? You spoke of the importance of multilateral avenues, the G7, perhaps as well. What is your evaluation of the degree of cooperation that's available to face this threat? Answer. I think that the Five Eyes group has gone quite far with this issue. This issue is taken seriously, but there are so many other issues worldwide that it's hard for G7 leaders to focus specifically on China. Our main allies are at NATO, however, and even if we speak on the margins of these various meetings of G7, for example, I think it's worthwhile that we do so. Thank you very much. I think with the time I have left, I won't be able to ask a question and receive an answer. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Lightbaum. Mr. Bergeron, now you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to our witnesses for being here with us tonight. Thank you for your comments, which are so relevant for our study. I'd like to follow up on the question asked by Mr. Paulus to Mr. Fadden on the number of agents found at the embassy or the mission. That is the Chinese diplomatic mission here in Canada. There's, of course, the number, but what each individual agent is doing is important as well. Do you not think it's important that we identify those who are indeed carrying out security operations, even if those are unassigned or unofficial activities? Answer. It can be very difficult to determine who is in charge of what. When I was at CSIS, we could not speak of methods at all. We could never divulge our methods, and so I'm afraid I won't be able to answer your question in detail. Question. Thank you very much. It seems important to me, however, that we should point out that it's simply not a matter of looking at a list and saying that, so-and-so is taking care of security. No, there are people who are taking care of security interests, but who do not have a title that signals this. we were completely blown over in this committee to learn that the VFS business, which is in charge of processing visas in China, is not only funded by a Chinese fund upstream, but you yourself said that it would be a point of entry for Chinese cyber spies. There's also the question of DOMTECT. When we asked the different Canadian security agencies, we were completely blown away to understand that no security checks had been done in either case. It seems as if the federal government didn't know what the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. These checks were not done. Is there something very worrying about that? Should we be double-checking the businesses with whom we do business? Answer. That's a sort of what I was talking about during my initial remarks. The federal government must have integrated activities, whole of government activities. This can be done, especially if the cabinet says, for example, for 6 countries, we'll do in-depth verifications. That doesn't mean that every time we buy something from any country, and particularly in particular, we have to undertake extensive checks. But these activities must be integrated so that things work properly, things are done effectively. There are perhaps 10 or so countries where we could pinpoint our efforts. And quite honestly, I think that the governments of Canada, I'm not talking specifically about the Trudeau government, the governments here in Canada doesn't really do that, even though the U.S. and France do pinpoint specific countries. I think we could do the same. Question. Yes, indeed. We're talking about services and equipment that are very sensitive, equipment that are used in Canadian missions abroad. And in one case, we're talking about access to all personal data from applicants for visas from people who want to come to Canada. Now, what can you tell us about VSF Global in Beijing? Answer. It's true that this center in Beijing and centers elsewhere do have access to Canadian databases in order to make decisions. It doesn't take much imagination to say that the Chinese agency operating under the directions of the Minister of Public Security could take advantage of this possibility to enter the Canadian federal data banks. I'll give you an example of what I mean. A few years ago in the New York Times, there was an article on how a small Texas storefront, a mom-and-pop store, was exploited by certain foreign countries to obtain data from many departments in Washington. An entry point is an entry point, no matter where it is. Now, this doesn't mean China is going to do this, but there is this possibility. And in my opinion, we should not have allowed this possibility to exist, especially if we did not do adequate checks beforehand. Thank you very much.
For 6 minutes. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for coming to join us tonight. Mr. Fadden, first of all to you, and I want to follow up slightly on VFS, and you've said recently, and you're recently quoted as saying that Canada should end its relationship with having the Beijing police looking after our visa center in China, in Beijing in particular, and you know, it's I can't disagree with you. It says, as you say, it's you can't think of a more promising entry point for cyber spies and other spies, I guess, and data entry. But Mr. Fadden, this started in, you know, we're told that the government didn't know about it until recently, but that's not actually true, because this started in 2008, and VFS indicates that they advised the government of Canada who their local contractor was, which they are required to have by Chinese laws. My question to you is that when you were head of CSIS, where was CSIS when all this was going on, starting in 2008? This has been going on for almost 20 years.
It's a fair question. I can say that when I was at CSIS, I never heard of this, and I wouldn't necessarily have had. But I think to repeat a little bit what I said in French a few minutes ago, one of the challenges we face, I think, in Canada is to develop an understanding of what we are going to do if we accept the view that countries like China present a risk. Among other things, it means we have to better integrate the activities of a variety of departments. We have Ms. Anand's department, which does the procurement, CSIS, which hopefully knows what's going on. We have immigration, which is the commissioning department. And I'm not sure that every time, on every occasion, everybody understands the risks that we're taking. Until we have a national consensus on the kinds of risks that you and your colleagues are talking about, it's very hard for a single agency to pop.
But there isn't this thing.
Going to have with Chinese. Retrospect we had.
If I may interrupt, but time is short here. You know, we don't have a signal agency. We do have CSIS. We do have the RCMP. We do have the CSE. We do have the RCMP. We have the bodies that are there supposed to be doing the job. What we seem to have, and I'm hearing it from you, I'm hearing it from all sorts of people, lots of fear mongering, lots of saying there's something going on, but there's all these gray zones. Where is the point at which they become bright lines? You're talking about, you mentioned about secrets being stolen by China. Well, if this is theft going on, surely that's a criminal activity, and either the laws are inadequate or the enforcement is, one or the other. And so, you know, we need advice from people like you who say, okay, well, look, the laws are inadequate. That's fine. The laws may be inadequate. Well, which laws are inadequate and what changes need to be made? What is it that we have to say? Foreign influence, like lots of countries like to influence other countries, and their disparasa play a role in that. And where is the line between influence and criminal activity? And someone's got to define that a lot better than we have right now. What is it we're trying to prevent? What's to be expected by any nation? And I'll ask Professor Ong a question after you answer that one.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the main distinction to be drawn between what is acceptable activity, in some cases diplomatic, and what is not, is the issue of secrecy. If another country is secretly trying through its agents to influence you or public servants or others, that falls into the rubric of foreign influence, foreign interference. If the Chinese embassy is doing it openly, or the Chinese consul general in Vancouver is doing it openly, that's not so much a problem. The other issue is if they try and use threats, either threats about something that's happening in Canada or in China. The difficulty there is that is very difficult to prove because people feel threatened. And we have to find a way to make people feel more comfortable coming forward and testifying. But if they have family back in China who are being threatened, it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to expect people to do that.
So, yeah, Professor Ong, and I know we have very limited time, I'm afraid, but you did have some recommendations you wanted to make. But I'd like to ask you, the United Front Work Department is very busy throughout the world, as we know. It's active in Canada, and I think part of their activity is the Confucius Institutes. Part of it is they've been accused of trying to influence candidates in elections and that sort of thing. Again, where is the fear-mongering stop and the actual activity that's targeted and illegal and something that ought to be prevented and exposed? Where does that come in? Your microphone is muted, I'm afraid.
Mr. Fadden, you're muted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think.
Or is it Ms. Ong? Sorry.
I think that needs to be studied very carefully by legal experts as well as intelligence experts. Where my expertise come in is that I do, from my vantage point, I do hear a lot of fear mongering in the media, on social media. I'm not saying that there's no potential of threat. There is also potential of threat, but I think there's also risk of threats being exaggerated. And I think one area that the government and I'm speaking of any party that could actually do better is to increase mainstream government's penetration into grassroots Chinese community. A lot of them, because they do not read English, they still rely on news and information from Chinese sources. If our government can actually do better, we can reach out to this grassroots community better, so they do not need to rely on Chinese language news from China.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Harris. And now we'll go on to the second round to Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Very strong testimony. Professor Ong, you've been very patient, and I, for one, would love to hear your recommendations, because I liked how you opened up your remarks about the balance between civil rights in this country versus the security threat. So I have 5 minutes. I'll give you a couple minutes, but I'm hoping for a little dialogue. But over to you, and I'd love to hear your recommendations. I will cut you off after 3.5, 4 minutes for sure, but over to you until then.
Sure. Thank you for that opportunity and the question. Number one, I would recommend that we boost our immunity by educating relevant government agencies of the risk of foreign interference and espionage. As someone who knows China and understands China, I'm also quite alarmed by some of the very basic, I think, things that we could have avoided. Such as working with Chinese police agencies, even though I think the chain may be very, very long, but if someone has done the work of investigating who actually owns VFS, I think we could have avoided that problem earlier. My number two recommendation is, and I think official discussion on espionage and foreign interference should adopt a country agnostic language that is in light of the skyrocketing anti-Asian hate crime that has been going on since the onset of the pandemic. Number three is I would recommend increased funding of Chinese language media and outreach programs to grassroots Chinese communities in order to reduce their reliance, as I mentioned, on foreign media sources for news and information coming from China. And number four is to recognize the enormous diversity of the Asian or Chinese community in Canada, and that their allegiance to either the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party, and I think should not be presumed.
I largely agree with your points, particularly the last one. Could I ask you about the first one? You'd mentioned government agencies. Would you include provinces and even universities and businesses in that on that list as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I will reiterate my position. I think there are potential of risks. From my vantage point, I'm not privy to any intelligence information, and I think there are potential of risk, but we must boost our immunity by becoming more prepared.
Yeah, let me ask you a question as an academic. What about charges if we were to freeze or sever relations between mainland China and universities? The notion that impacts on academic freedom. Where does that end?
I think.
What's your answer?
I think that would be a grave mistake, because I think the university sector benefits greatly from exchanges and interaction with our Chinese partners. And it's all a continuum, right? And we are so naive or ignorant about all the risks, and then we expose ourselves to the risk. If we could become more educated of the risk, we are a lot more prepared and benefit from those exchanges.
So is theft not a problem, or I mean, I'm not talking about an academic exchange. Right. We're talking about research here, scientific research, for example.
Theft is potentially an issue. I am not aware of any of those incidents.
Okay.
I'm a social scientist. I'm not in engineering, so my research is not funded by Huawei and those politically sensitive areas. Fair
enough. I got another question. You had an interesting point about an agnostic approach. That's an interesting concept, but how do you take that approach when you're dealing with a country like China, which is it's the 800-pound gorilla? No other country in the world compares to it in terms of its size, its ideology, and at times even its aggressiveness.
Any informed and smart person, like everyone in this room would know the elephant in the room. But I think, being agnostic, we can, prevent a lot of finger pointing and then racial profiling.
And the red baiting. Okay, I see. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I have a quick question for Mr. Fadden. Mr. Fadden, you talked about is it strategic adversary, which is kind of a nice sounding term. I know it's a hockey team, but then you mentioned an 8 out of 10. That's quite a high alert level. I assume a 10 is conflict. So is strategic adversary in fact the right term? Does that really convey the threat?
It's a good question. I mean, it's the term that I've sort of adopted, as have others. What it's trying to do, from my perspective, is to say that it's strategic in the sense that it's global. They're after us, if I can use the vernacular, from a whole variety of perspectives, and they're after us in a negative sort of way. That's all I meant by that. There probably is a better expression.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williamson. And we'll now go to Ms. Zan for 5 minutes. Ms. Zan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Fadden. I just wanted to ask you about a recent report by CBC on one of your current ventures regarding the Oz Ventures based in Toronto. The company seems to have attracted a number of former conservative politicians to its ranks, including former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And I find it interesting that after you served for so long with the Harper administration, you're now working so closely with him. Do you advise the former Prime Minister on any foreign policy as it relates to China?
No. As a matter of fact, I joined Oz Councils of Advisors before Mr. Harper member. I do not advise Mr. Harper on absolutely anything whatsoever. My advice goes to Oz.
So do any of the companies that you work for do business with China or work for China?
It's one of the policies of that company, of Oz, not to deal with, amongst other countries, China. I think Russia is another one of those.
Okay, thank you. Now, regarding defense foreign policy, Mr. Fadden, in your role as the National Security Advisor, you would have engaged with the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces, and I assume matters related to China would have crossed your desk as a result. So how many of those files would have been from the former Chief of Defense Staff that you helped to appoint?
I really can't answer the question. You can imagine that the number of files that I dealt with over the course of the years, I just don't know the answer to that. I would say not very many, but I don't know.
And so Stephen Harper did appoint General Vance in July of 2015, and I believe Aaron O'Toole was also at his cabinet table. So when General Vance was under active investigation by the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service, apparently just days after the Conservatives appointed General Vance, the police investigation was suddenly dropped. And according to ATIP, the commanding officer said that he was under pressure. So we know from testimony at the Defense Committee that Mr. Harper's former Chief of Staff, Ray Novak, confirmed it was you who briefed the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office that NIS had actually found nothing further with respect to the general's time at NATO, and that their review of the matter was closed. And Mr. Novak also said that operationally, you had led the process at PCO for appointing Vance, and that you would have been liaising with DND and CFNIS. So can you please tell me, were you the one who helped to pressure Canada's military police to stop the sexual misconduct investigation into General Vance because of your association with Mr. Harper?
Let me make clear up front, I had no association with Mr. Harper. I was a public servant, and I served him as loyally as I served Mr. Chrétien, and as I tried to serve Mr. Trudeau. I happened to be in a job that involved the appointment of Vance, and that was the end of it. I was involved in coordinating a number of candidates who ultimately were considered for the job of CDS, along with a number of others. We interviewed them. But I would like to point out also that appointments by the governor and council at that level don't involve investigation into individuals' private lives, because at the time we had no indication that there was a problem with General Vance's life, except in one instance, I did a bit of an inquiry into what was happening with a lady who subsequently became his wife when he was stationed at NATO headquarters in Naples, not NATO, but Naples. And that was the extent of the involvement.
And so you didn't have anything to do with putting any pressure on them to drop that?
Nothing whatsoever.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a question. Do you believe that a well-run military is important for international relations, particularly in Canada's case when it comes to supporting the United Nations missions abroad?
Point of order,
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair.
This is related to Canada and China relations.
I'm going to stop the clock. Mr. Janis, do you have a point of order?
Thank you. Ms. Zahn is telling me it's relevant to the work of the committee.
It's very relevant.
My point. I haven't even yet stated what my point of order is about. Mr. Chair, I will note that Liberal members of the Defence Committee voted to shut down an inquiry into the appointment of General Vance. So it's interesting that they shut down the inquiry at the Defence Committee, and now they're trying to bring it up at the Canada-China Committee on an unrelated topic. If Liberals want to adjudicate this issue, perhaps they will support reopening the investigation at the Defence Committee.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Ms. Zahn,
Here.
when someone is raising a point of order, you have to wait until you're recognized by the chair. Okay. Now, I'm not sure I heard Mr. Janis in terms of what his point of order is particularly. I mean, I think I know where he's going. I heard that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was about relevance, but I was trying to be constructive and give the Liberals an opportunity to adjudicate these same issues at another committee where they had previously shut down the study of this very issue.
Thank you, Mr. Janis. So we are studying the national security aspects of the relationship between Canada and China, and I would, while of course members have a pretty broad leeway, I would ask them to try to bring their questions within that context. Ms. Zahn, you have about 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is extremely important. Canadians deserve to know what exactly each witness is bringing to the committee, and that includes their experience and any bias. And it would seem to me that my Conservative colleague is making me think that perhaps they're worried about the questioning and where it's leading, especially since Erin O'Toole was on the cabinet.
Bring it up at the Defence Committee.
Order.
I'm not in the Defence Committee.
And that concludes Ms. Zahn's time. Thank you very much, Ms. Zahn. We'll now go on. Et maintenant, on continue avec Monsieur Bergeron pendant.
Mr. Bergeron, you have 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Chair, this type of situation makes me very uncomfortable when we have witnesses showing up here in good faith to give testimony on subjects that interest us. Be that as it may, Mr. Fadden, I'd like to come back to a question that was asked of you by Mr. Paulus again. The question concerned the reaction Canada should have to cyber attacks that could come from China. I often use this data. According to Greg Orston at the Strategic Institute, the cyber attack capacities of China are greatly inferior than those of China. Canada would be 9th among more than 150 countries, whereas China is only at the 27th rank. Why is it that China is a threat to Canada, whereas Canada is not a threat to China, given this ranking from Mr. Austin? Answer, I completely disagree with Mr. Austin. I don't think that China is only in the 20th rank with regard to cyber attack capacity. I don't think China is number 1, but they're certainly in the first 5. They have made great advances in the last decade. They are a fundamental threat, not only for us, but for other countries such as the U.S. If what Mr. Austin is suggesting was true, President Obama would not have negotiated an agreement, a type of agreement with China to attempt to reduce the number of cyber attacks. So I don't think that China is not a threat. Question, does Mr. Austin drawing on obsolete data? How is it that this ranking was determined when it comes from such a credible institution as this institute? Answer, I don't know. All I can tell you is that based on my experience in national security, and that was many years of experience, no one, German, American, French, British, or otherwise, would have said that China ranks only in the 20 plus rank. So you think that China has much greater cybersecurity, cyber attack capacity than Canada? Answer, Canada, it does have advanced capacity, but Canada has been able in the past to stop these attacks. In recent months, China has been able to circumvent this defense, this Canadian defense. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. We'll go on.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Fadden, I can go back to you, please, for a moment. We were talking briefly about academic activities involving Chinese researchers. You say at one point that you can't go down the rabbit hole of suspecting every Chinese student coming to Canada, but you go even farther than most people in saying that there's 10 or so areas of study with national security implications, and suggesting that Chinese students would not be able to study them in Canada, and that there should not be any research collaboration with them. Could you identify those 10 areas, or some of them, if you can come to mind quickly, and tell us how is it that you have such a hard line on that, and how do you justify that, or how would Canada justify that?
Well, I think it's a more generalized practice within the Five Eyes and NATO countries in general. I honestly agree with Ms. Ng's view that we need to have as many exchanges with the Chinese as we can possibly generate. But I do think that there are some sectors of activity, I happen to pick 10 or 12, I don't remember the exact number, where I think that our national security and the national security of our allies is put at risk if we have exchanges. Because no matter how well-intentioned might a university professor or team be in Canada who receives a Chinese grant, whatever he or she discovers, it's going to go back to China. On most items, if you think of the breadth of our economy, I think is absolutely fine. Do I think it's fine in the area of high-level optics, nuclear affairs, and a bunch of other areas like that? I think the risk is too great. If you accept my basic premise that China is indeed an adversary, I don't think we should be making it easy for them to acquire intelligence on areas that are pretty critical to the national security of the West.
And how do you enforce that?
Well, I think you have a debate amongst your committee, you propose legislation, and you simply say that no foreign power, as indicated by the Governor and Council, may provide grants or contributions of any sort to a Canadian academic institution for the purposes of working in this very limited number of fields. I think it's doable. I think it would be painful, and I think we need a debate about it. I'm articulating my view. I'm not so delusional as to think everybody would agree with me, but I think it's worth talking about.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Harris. Maintenant, il nous reste que quelques minutes. Alors, 3 minutes pour Monsieur Paul.
3 minutes for Mr. Paulus. We don't have much time left. Thank you, Chair. Quickly, Mr. Fadden, I'd like to know when it comes to political influence. In 2016, there was much news about Chinese donations to Mr. Trudeau. 45 checks to his writing station. There was 2 Chinese donors who gave quite a lot of money to the foundation, the Trudeau Foundation, and so on. What can you say about this political influence, especially when it comes to the Prime Minister? Answer, I think there are specific regulations with regard to what members of government can and cannot accept in terms of donations, even though they're, and I'll say I'm not an expert, even if a particular rule is not broken, the perception that an agent or an agent from a foreign country or a foreigner gives money to a riding association is not a good one. Now, when it comes to the Trudeau Foundation, I think that we're talking about something different. It's a charitable organization. That's a different story. But if we're talking about a politician, then I don't think this type of donation should be made. Thank you. Question. When it comes to Huawei, we're still waiting for confirmation from the various agencies. Knowing how things work, do you think that the government already has the necessary recommendations for this question of 5G? Answer. I'll probably be franker than I should be. If I worked for one of those agencies now, and I heard a politician say that we're still awaiting answers, I would be very insulted. Do I still have time? Yes, 1 minute? All right. Mr. Fadden, what would be the number one piece of advice you'd give to our committee? Answer. I agree with Professor Ong. I think we need to speak much more about these issues than we currently do. If Canadians do not accept that we have a problem with China and other countries, then it's going to be very difficult for you and other parliamentarians to change things. We need to be proactive. I think we need to talk about this issue. I think we need to come up with a consensus, a national consensus. And as I said to Mr. Harris, whether you agree with me or not is not important. What is important is that a variety of opinions be discussed a great deal so that you can arrive at a consensus. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Paulus. Mr. Dubourg, you have 3 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would also like to say hello to our 2 witnesses. Thank you for taking part in our meeting. Thank you for your speeches. I'd like to begin by asking a few questions to Professor Ong. You work at a university. In October 2020, you said that the Chinese Communist Party has not succeeded in demonstrating its legitimacy or increasing its popularity by these Confucius institutions. Can you please tell us how China uses these institutes as a public relations tool?
I think Confucius Institute is funded by the Chinese government to promote Chinese languages and Chinese culture overseas. And its actual operation and its consequences on host countries actually varies across from one locality to another. Sometimes, with the Confucius Institute within a certain university or education institutes, people in charge may self-censor. They may not invite, people to speak about Uyghur issues, Taiwan issues, for the fear of offending people that actually fund them. But I'm also aware of certain circumstances that what the Confucius Institutes actually do is to, teach Chinese and teach language cultures. So, its actual operation actually differs a great deal. So when I say that the Chinese government hasn't been that successful in projecting its soft power, because there has been so much pushback against it, we don't hear of successful cases of them educating people about Chinese language. We hear the pushback, from the United States, Australia, UK to Africa. So I think in that sense, the negative news so much more overwhelmed the positive news.
Oui. Merci.
Thank you. But tell me, do you fear the increase in the number of Confucius institutes in the last few years?
Like I said at the beginning, I think there's potential risk of undue influence, and that may become foreign interference. But I think we also need to understand why is there a demand for Confucius Institute, the sort of programs that they offer, because people want to learn Chinese language, Chinese programs, and there's lack of funding for this sort of programs. So if the government could actually increase funding, the demand is actually met, then people wouldn't go for Confucius Institutes anymore.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Dubourg.
Thank you, Mr. Dubourg.
To our witnesses, we really appreciate your being with us this evening. We'll now excuse you as we wait for, as we prepare for the next panel. We'll take a 2-minute, we'll suspend for 2 minutes as we arrange the microphones and so forth with the panelists. Thank you so much. Meeting back to order. For our second panel, I would now like to welcome as individuals Gordon Holden, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, Director Emeritus, China Institute, University of Alberta, and Paul Evans, Professor, School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia. Thank you for being here. Mr. Holden, let's start with you for the opening remarks. Please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and honourable members. I'm appearing as an individual capacity and not as a representative of the University of Alberta. Altering Chinese behaviour, especially within China, is challenging. This does not mean that we should not try, but rather we need to be modest in our expectations. I'll focus instead, however, on China's activities in Canada. Here, there are greater prospects of modifying Chinese behavior, or at least responding to China's conduct. As a sovereign state, we have a responsibility to protect our democratic institutions, our citizens, our economy, and the results of Canadian ingenuity. But care must also be taken to ensure that Canada remains open to the world, and that includes the 20% of humanity that is Chinese. I was include in Chinese actions that have a direct impact on Canada the treatment of Canadian citizens in China, including the egregious cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. China's interest in the Chinese diaspora does not necessarily end when Chinese nationals obtain foreign citizenship. We need to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate contacts between national governments and their citizens abroad. It is normal and acceptable for governments to contact their citizens overseas and for diplomatic and consular representatives to meet with their nationals when the individual is willing to do so. This allows Canada to access our citizens when they may be experiencing difficulties, including arrest. China maintains similar contacts with their own nationals, and that will include the large number of Chinese nationals studying at Canadian educational institutions, some 200,000 pre-COVID. But where there is pressure on Canadian citizens, landed immigrants, and even PRC nationals extending to tracking their political views, pressuring any of these persons to change their behavior, or actions that are illegitimate, this must be countered by Canada where detected. In some instances, a simple warning to desist conveyed by Global Affairs Canada to Chinese officials may suffice. That was part of my government experience. But in egregious instances, more vigorous action may be required. In extreme cases, it could mean that individuals in Chinese missions might be expelled or prosecution undertaken against individuals who engaged in threats or other illegal acts who do not have diplomatic or consular status. Further complication is that knowledge of such coercion may be available only to Canadian intelligence services, who are often unwilling to openly use information gathered because of the risk that it would expose intelligence methods or sources. I would add that it may be more useful to examine some of these issues in the closed-door meetings of the House Security and Intelligence Committee, where Government of Canada information can be more freely available. Intelligence organizations, particularly those of large and powerful states like China, will continue to collect intelligence and carry out their mandates, even if these activities may damage bilateral relations with foreign states. This does not mean that actions to curb such activities by governments cannot have any effect. It rather means that such intelligence functions will tend to reoccur and require repeated action. China is now graduating roughly 8 times the number of STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, as the United States, while having only 4 times the US population. While the flow of S&T has been largely from the West to China, it will be increasingly important for the West to track and absorb advances achieved in Chinese universities and its expansive network of state laboratories, although this will not be easily achieved. A further challenge is the commercialization of scientific discoveries. The joint team of Canadian medical researchers working with Chinese partners are far more likely to put into production a medical device in Suzhou than in Halifax, given China's vast industrial capacity. Changing that calculus is desirable, but difficult. Effort also must be made to safeguard intellectual property, especially, but not only where there are national security concerns. Formation of Government of Canada Universities Working Group that will allows Canadian universities to meet regularly with federal departments and agencies is an important step. I look forward to their report later this year. However, universities and scientists must be cognizant of security risks and in the protection of intellectual property. I'm still, however, not entirely comfortable with upending the long tradition of academic freedom and university autonomy without a strong rationale. Government intrusion into key Canadian institutions, such as universities, must be carefully calibrated and justified. We are not in a Cold War with China, at least not yet. The flow of US capital to China, both foreign direct investment as well as portfolio investment, accelerated in 2020. Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, Google, Volkswagen, Toyota, Samsung, and most other high-tech companies maintain extensive research laboratories in China, drawing on local talent. While national and political interference, security and political interference by China will continue to pose challenges to Canadian sovereignty, there also needs to be a sophisticated Canadian strategy to balance risk and opportunity. Recommendations, very briefly. The Government of Canada provide greater clarity to Canadian universities regarding the federal assessment of what is and what is not problematic cooperation with Chinese universities and scientists, including dual-use technologies. that a comparative
Mr.
study
Holden,
be undertaken.
Mr. Holden, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your 5 minutes is concluded. I suspect and hope that one of my colleagues will ask you to give the rest of your recommendations when they're posing questions, but I'm required now to go to Mr. Evans for 5 minutes.
Of course, and that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Evans, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for a second opportunity to appear before the committee. Today, I will focus on Canadian universities, their importance as the foundation of engagement between Canada and China, and their responses to rising concerns about new national security and safety threats. I speak as an individual professor, not a representative of the University of British Columbia. The involvement of Canadian universities in and with China has expanded dramatically in the past 40 years. It is now a huge enterprise with multiple layers. Roughly 140,000 students from the PRC are registered at post-secondary institutions across Canada. Canadian universities have hundreds of MOUs with Chinese partners for faculty and student exchanges and training programs. There are hundreds of research collaborations funded from a combination of Canadian and Chinese sources. These have shifted from capacity building to, in many cases, advanced collaborations doing cutting-edge research and work. At UBC, for example, there are about 6,500 People's Republic of China students. More than 300 professors have a significant professional interest in China. Faculty have partnerships with more than 100 different Chinese institutions. Beyond economic impact, China connections are widely valued as integral to the global mission of our institutions, enriching the learning environment for our students, facilitating advanced research and training, and providing a meeting place for exchange. These connections are under increasing scrutiny in Canada, but even in more intense ways in the United States and Australia, as geopolitical competition and confrontation with China have intensified. Security and intelligence agencies in Ottawa have identified concerns related to cybersecurity, leakage of intellectual property, and transfer of technology and ideas that are seen as benefiting the Chinese military and other state institutions involved in violation of human rights. The media has identified risks to academic integrity and freedom generated by too heavy a reliance on Chinese tuition revenues and Chinese funding from sources including Huawei. Other concerns focus on instances of improper surveillance and harassment of individuals, confrontations between student groups on contentious issues such as Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet that affect student well-being and our general academic atmosphere. Ottawa, our universities, and funding agencies have established collaborative mechanisms, as Mr. Holden just stated, that focus on sensitizing universities to risks that they face, particularly in the domains of cybersecurity and protection of intellectual property. They have produced guidelines on research hygiene and safeguarding scientific integrity that are now being rolled out across the country. What action is needed? Well, what I just mentioned are necessary first steps, but much more is needed at the level of institutions, individual institutions, and at the national level. For the universities, key priorities are improving awareness of risks, building mechanisms for vigilance, and instituting proactive measures to monitor and maintain a respectful atmosphere on our campuses. We need to revisit and revise many existing agreements with Chinese partners when warranted to maximize transparency and our academic values. One of the biggest challenges is how we make these adjustments without fanning anti-Chinese racism and stigmatizing professors and students of Chinese descent who already feel targeted by anti-China sentiment and unwarranted suspicion about their connections with China. Nationally, the key issues are defining exactly what areas of research are considered sensitive and exactly the criteria for determining what partners are sensitive or inappropriate. Very difficult indeed. More broadly, we need a policy statement from the government on how and why academic, business, and other people-to-people engagement matter. Academic connections with China are valued and deeply rooted, but to keep the doors open to a dynamic range of interactions and collaborations with China, we need to install some new screens and close some windows.
Thank you, Professor.
I look forward to your
you.
questions.
Oh, thank you very much. Pretty good timing. We will now begin our first round of questions. Mr. Chong, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Professor Evans and Professor Holden, to our committee. I have a question about what both of you mentioned in your opening statement, which is that universities have been telling us that they've received no directives, no advice from the federal government regarding partnerships with companies like Huawei. Recently, the University of Toronto entered into a partnership with Huawei, and the university said that the Canadian government had not advised them against collaborating with that Chinese company. They were quoted as saying, quote, "We look to the federal government for actionable direction and guidance. There has been no change in the actions of the government with respect to Huawei Canada and its operations in this country," end quote. And today in the Globe, the University of Alberta is quoted as saying, quote, "We have received no directives related to China," end quote, from the federal government to stop its engagement with Chinese institutions. And we know that the minister is looking to come forward with new risk guidelines for research projects. So my first question to you is, would you be comfortable if the federal government said to universities, we are advising you against partnerships with the following companies, such as Huawei, and here is what we mean against, here's what we define as a partnership. So that still respects academic freedom, but it's clear advice to universities and to professors and to the academic community, to the academy, about what the federal government's position on this. Would you be comfortable with if that were what the federal government were to do?
Is that directed to one of us in particular, or both?
To both of you, yes.
Well, perhaps if Professor Holden would allow me, let me take a first crack at that fundamental question. I think that universities, and not just our administrations, but our professors, don't want to see directives from the top that they are not part of discussion. Now, if the government of Canada decides that China is the kind of adversary that some witnesses have described, that's a blanket. That's what the Americans have thrown over many of their collaborations that universities maintain, for example, with Huawei. But if we are going to be more selective and say that there are certain kinds of activities that in certain fields, after discussion about what those are, I think there would be a great deal of acceptance. We need general political guidelines. But once we get into the fine tuning, Mr. Chong, as we've seen in the United States and in Australia, these are very tricky domains. And with no disrespect to Ottawa, the scientific knowledge that is necessary to put up a high fence around a small plot in those 11 areas or 12 areas that are being discussed now is not yet seen as persuasive. It might be, but we need a deep collaborative process very quickly over the next 6 months.
Thank you.
If I could just jump in to add a few words. I don't want to repeat anything that Paul has said, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the University of Alberta. Universities have asked for advice, or at least indicated they haven't received it. So the straightforward answer to your question would be, yes, advice would be welcome. But that advice, I would hope, would be sophisticated. It would be technically advanced, and there'd be rationale behind it. In other words, I'm a jealous defender of the autonomy of Canadian institutions. I welcome government interference where it's warranted, but it should be soundly based. But yes, dialogue is a must.
Okay. I have a bit of very different question. It's been sort of rattling around in my head for a while now. this wolf warrior diplomacy, to me, doesn't seem to be a very effective way for China to advance its diplomacy. Recently, one of their diplomats in Brazil referred to our prime minister as, quote, a running dog, end quote, of the United States. Why are they using this type of diplomacy? Like, what do they view this as effective, or is this intended for a domestic audience back in China? Like, what is the rationale behind it? Because to me, it looks counterproductive.
Could I take a first crack at that one?
Sure.
Okay, good. I think China's still feeling its way as a great power. I couldn't agree more that random tweets from third countries, as in that case from Rio de Janeiro from the Consul General, are counterproductive. China will have to deal with the government of Canada and the people within it, in the government and the opposition, criticizing them directly and unfairly is counterproductive. And I think there are no shortage of people in the foreign ministry and government that understand that. But there is a nationalist streak in China right now, and those kind of replies are very popular with many Chinese.
Professor Holden, you mentioned in earlier testimony at another committee, the Industry, Science and Technology Committee, that China's foreign direct investment in Canada is much more than we realize, because investment arrives via third countries.
Mr. Chong, I'm sorry to tell you that your 6 minutes has concluded, and hopefully there'll be another chance.
My question was quickly, and I'll just put it out there, Mr. Chair, just so you can answer another round, is what other third countries does China, what other third countries does China invest in Canada? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. All right. We'll go on now to Mr. Prajus for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Evans, you recently said, and I'm going to quote you, this was quoted in media, we need to engage our China discussion in a new and more active way, even if it's dangerous and risky to be labeled as pro-China. What did you mean by that? Could you elaborate?
The atmosphere of discussion about China now in a number of countries, the United States, Australia, and increasingly Canada, is polarized and angry. And we are all reflecting the difficulties of our current bilateral problems with the People's Republic. We're angry about a number of behaviors. But the atmosphere, the vindictiveness of it, the attacks on social media for individuals, particularly those who are coming out in favor of an engagement strategy, is somewhat intense. And it is an era that occasionally has elements of a McCarthy period at an earlier phase, when the discussion is not just about one's views on one side of the issue or the other, engagement or adversary, that's an intellectual and policy debate. But when we get into matters of integrity and, in fact, the loyalty of individuals who are making positions, taking positions that try for nuance in understanding situations from a Chinese perspective, even if we don't agree with that perspective. I think we are in a phase of our discussion on China that I haven't seen since we've established diplomatic recognition in 1970.
Point taken, and I did listen quite intently, to your whole testimony, of course, but I was particularly interested where you talked about the need for liberal democracies to ensure that policies that they take towards China do not have the impact of stoking anti-Chinese sentiment in their own societies. And we've heard from other witnesses about the importance of that in previous meetings. But this is a regime that is markedly different from previous Chinese regimes, right? The administration under President Xi, according to many, our parliament recognized it. The British Parliament has recently moved in the direction. Of course, I'm speaking about the genocide of the Uyghur minority. It is not just politicians that have put their opinion forward. It's leading
observers of international law and human rights scholars, Erwin Kotler, for example. With all that in mind, how can we, on the one hand, stand up as a country to China in a constructive way, in a way that's meaningful, but also avoid doing what you're doing, which is you're cautioning against a sort of narrow-minded approach that leads to hate sentiment, that leads to racism, that limits the discussion to zero-sum outcomes. If I understand your position correctly, what would be your counsel on that? And if there's time, I'll ask the same question to Professor Holden.
Well, anti-China sentiment and anti-Chinese racism are not the same thing, but they sometimes hold hands. And the danger is that extreme anti-China statements fan the bellows that can fan embers. When I have Chinese colleagues who are terribly upset that a general portrayal of China as an adversary and people connected to it as potential spies, as potential as potential agents of influence. When we hit that part in our public discussion, we need to take a little bit of a break and calm down. We have to deal with a China that is extremely difficult, extremely challenging, but be surgical in the words we use.
Thank you very much. Professor Holden, any thoughts on this same subject?
Sure. I'm happy to add a couple of words. I think that there is that risk. I know that many of my Canadians of Chinese heritage friends are very uncomfortable now with the tone of the dialogue, and it's reflected in its crudest manner and sometimes in street incidents of racism, graffiti, and that sort of thing. I think there's an element of maturity needed in Parliament, amongst academics, in the media, to provide an element of leadership that one can, as suggested, criticize policies of the government of China without criticizing that 20% of the world that is Chinese. It's too easy to slip into a demonization factor, which might be appropriate if one was at war, but we're not at war. We have immigrants arriving from that country. We have almost 2 million of our fellow citizens who are of Chinese heritage. So a certain delicacy and in speech is necessary. And I think leadership from universities, from the media, and from Parliament in terms of the language used so as to not feed crude racism.
I thank you very much for that. I don't unfortunately have time for another question, but I want to thank you in particular because you've presented us with a nuanced view and one that I hope all colleagues around the table take very seriously. I think they will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fragiskalis. Et maintenant, nous continuerons avec...
Now we'll go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for their for their comments, particularly with regard to the nuances that should be established. It's one thing to criticize the policies of the People's Republic of China. It's another thing to have anti-Chinese sentiment. These are two things that are completely different, in my opinion. Now, some security experts who have appeared before us would say that you're fairly frank with regard to your, in respect to your comments on China. Some may believe that we shouldn't make things worse. Now, it appears that you're saying that it appears that China is doing exactly that, though, making things worse. Canada has tried to make nice with China, and this has led to absolutely nothing. Now the tone needs to be, we need to take a sharper tone as a country and in working with other countries. What do you think? Is it true that we've tried but not succeeded in collaborating or cooperating, and yet China has nonetheless become more aggressive towards Canada?
Well, if I could respond first, my the fundamental problem we're wrestling with that you mentioned or hinted at is in essence the 3 M's problem: Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, and Madame Meng. And from the inextricable nature of that problem has brought out the worst in elements of Chinese behavior, which is coercive economic and hostage diplomacy. From their perspective, we are playing a similar game. And so as we express our anger, as we try to find friends who want to support us, the real objective is to find a way to unravel this problem. And that is going to ultimately demand a diplomatic solution to a problem where we don't count our friends on the basis of who stands up to criticize China, but those who help us find some useful pathways to unraveling the Madame Meng case. And there, I think, primarily the challenge is our relationship with the United States.
Monsieur Holden,
Mr. Holden,
souhaitez-vous ajouter quelque chose?
Mr. Holden, would you like to add anything?
And that is that, to me, I don't expect the Chinese behavior is going to change drastically for the better. Certainly, as Paul hints, when the 3 M's are dealt with, we could return, I would hope, to a somewhat more normal relationship, exchanges, high-level visits, and dialogue. However, the physics of power and the nature of the Xi Jinping and of the top echelons of the Communist Party are such that they are prepared more than in the past to use that power, that Deng Xiaoping maxim of hide your strength, bide your time. I would argue China's time has arrived in their eyes, and they are prepared to be somewhat more aggressive, to throw their weight around, and to act like the great power, even the superpower in waiting that they are. That, I fear, is the reality.
Monsieur Holden.
Mr. Holden, last February, National Counterintelligence and Security Center of the U.S. identified data collected by the Beijing Institute. This was said to be very worrying, especially since China is also collecting DNA for national reasons. There is an agreement with or an exchange with the National Genome Institute of Beijing. Is this worrying? What should we do to avoid this type of situation?
Well, these are going to be complex technical issues. Clearly, we do not want to provide Chinese databases or Chinese authorities with any personal information that could be used against either Canada or their own citizens. But there is space, I believe, for scientific collaboration that does not involve security risk. I take what the US security authorities say very seriously, and I'd argue that so should CSIS. I'm sure they do. And we need to, and this is again perhaps getting back to that question of comments from our security authorities, from the government of Canada to universities, where they may see danger. Quite frankly, individual professors, even university administrators, will not necessarily understand the risk of a particular subject in detail. There needs to be highly technical discussions in some cases, and scientists who are pursuing pure science may not be aware of some of the potential consequences of what they're doing. That dialogue must be a regular one.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Now we'll go to Mr. Harris for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both you gentlemen for coming to join us this evening. The most interesting topic. Professor Evans, I was going to say before you mentioned the Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig that there were actually 2 names that answer the question as to why there is so much righteous, I think, anger at China for their behavior. Because it's understandable. It's understandable. 2 people are taken, and clearly in retribution to what in Canada is a legal act that's in relation to a treaty on extradition and being treated under the law as it is, as opposed to an arbitrary detention. So it has led to an awful lot of further examination, of course, and I agree with you that in many cases and many individuals, it's gone too far in terms of actual hatred and anti-Asian prejudice and acts, and that's deplorable as well. But I want to get we're talking about academics here, and I wanted to raise a question which bedevils me to some extent, and has to do with the Confucius Institute. So they came around starting in 2004 or thereabouts, but they were fairly early recognized as being an instrument of the Chinese state, or at least the Chinese Communist Party directly operating internationally. In 2014, the CAUT, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, of which I'm sure you're probably members, actually called upon the universities to not have anything to do with the Chinese Institute and the Confucius Institute, citing the closing of the Confucius Institute in Sherbrooke, Quebec. The University of Manitoba voted against hosting them out of concerns over political censorship. McMaster canceled his contracts following an instructor's human rights complaint, et cetera, et cetera. And yet they persisted to this day in some places. Academic freedom, of course, was the big issue and is a big issue in academia, persisting to this very day, an extremely important facet of university life. Why have they persisted, and why, if it's about Chinese language training and culture, we have, someone pointed out that I think Professor Holden, nearly 2 million Canadians of Chinese descent. We have 140,000 students here. We can learn about or teach Chinese languages and culture from the people that we have. So why is that not happening, and why are universities relying on the Confucius Institutes?
Mr. Harris, universities aren't relying on Confucius Institutes in the sense that some universities that don't have the resources to fund language training have used them. At our university, University of British Columbia, we decided not to partner with the Confucius Institutes, partly because it was, as we saw, too connected to the propaganda side of the Chinese government, but also because we teach Chinese language in a different way. But having said that, the most studies that are done on Confucius Institutes is in the United States. And most of those studies it's pretty innocuous what Confucius Institutes actually do. They don't influence people's political views. One can dislike the Confucius Institutes. I think what we should do for those institutions that want to have them is complete transparency. Go in, investigate, look. Now, there's a whole side to Han nationalism that plays through in their curriculum, and we'd have to look at that carefully. But in and of themselves, they are not an evil. They are not an outreach location for deep subversion. They're just, I think, a foolishly considered Chinese way of trying to get the world to learn Chinese language and culture.
Professor Holden, do you have any separate views from that? We're not hearing you, sir. Your microphone is off.
The problem, as I see it, is funding. I know it sounds like, yes, we have the Chinese Canadians who can teach Chinese, although not all of them can. It's who funds it. In the United States, who's the #1 funder of Chinese language? U.S. Defense Department. Because the United States understands that China is a comprehensive competition for the United States, and they need thousands, ideally tens of thousands of fluent Chinese speakers. We in Canada have not mustered the same effort. Public school boards have not done the same thing. And for that reason, I would say more money for Chinese language from governments.
Thank you. I see the chair giving me the 1 minute finger here, but I'll just put the question out there because, and I think part of it has been answered, but we hear the University of Alberta, for example, declining to discuss its research activities with China, other than to say we have received no directives related to China from the federal government to stop its engagement with Chinese institutions. Yet we hear CISA saying all the time that they're engaging academia with guidance and guidelines and all of that. And there seems to be a disconnect in that story.
If there's a one sentence answer, it would be my view that the universities need to be more transparent to the media, to our politicians, about what they are doing with China, whether that's on Confucius Institutes or funding from Huawei. A head in the sand is not the right way to convince Canadians that we are doing something that is in all of our value and that we're aware of the risk.
Thank you very much. I think I'll refer to that as the 1 minute signal. Mr. Harris, if you don't mind. All right, we'll go on to the second round now. We have Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, and you've certainly sparked a good conversation. Just a point of protocol. Is it Professor Holden or Mr. Holden?
Well, it's both.
That's what I thought. Okay, Professor Holden, thank you. You've earned it, so I'd like to use the titles. Could I ask you, off the top, you said something that you looked at the raw numbers. Is it your belief that because of the raw numbers in China, the number of scientists that are coming through, research grads, that they're going to outthink us, outproduce us because of the size? My question is, what weight do you give to a free society to actually be the spark that triggers innovation, research, and innovation? Because if you say it's a level playing field, I would disagree with you on that. But I want to make sure I understood your comments.
We're only going to know the answer to that question in the fullness of time. I do believe that free societies, free universities have an advantage in creativity, and we see that especially in Chinese universities on the social sciences, where they're hopelessly backward because of censorship. It's on the science side, and they spend the money, and they've been leaping ahead. But size has a quality all its own. And if the Chinese are now graduating 8 times as many STEM graduates, that over time will accrue and will be tremendously important. China is closing on the United States for the largest economy. Is conceivable by 2050, they could be twice the size, even before that. So that is a challenge to the West. Acting collectively, I think our free institutions could be the match. And China will change over time. But we don't know the good answer to your question until we see the results, unfortunately.
Well, I think that the future we don't know, but I think we can certainly look back through history and see that free nations have outcompeted those that have been closed. And I'm not just talking about the 20th century. I'm talking about why China fell when it was at its height, and then fell behind the West. It was because I think in part because of its system of government. On that, Professor Evans, you had said something that exchanges are important. I want to ask you to kind of explain why that is. Person to person, when individuals within China, and I certainly recognize there's a difference between the citizens of that great country and the Politburo in Beijing. Why is it important when citizens in China can't vote, can't influence their government? We've seen when they do speak out, they could either lose their job or at times disappear. Why do you think that exchange is so important when they are in fact powerless to determine the direction of their government, unlike citizens in free countries around the world?
Mr. Williamson, I think that we need exchanges with a lot of different kinds of Chinese. It can be cultural associations without always fearing that they're united front connected. And those are real people in all of our ridings in our neighborhood. We need discussion with top scientists and researchers so far as we can do that, and we need to train them. We also need it with Chinese government officials. The most useful collaboration I've ever had on the Chinese side was with people from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs on how we build multilateral institutions in Asia. And these things have to be looked at very carefully, screened, what kind of information is being provided. But I think we need multi-tiered activities with Chinese colleagues. You know, it becomes a really difficult problem Who shouldn't we be working with in China? Who shouldn't we? Is it because they're a member of the Chinese Communist Party? Because they're connected to the military? Making those distinctions demand an enormous amount of discussion on our side, but also intelligence, due diligence about who those partners are. And often we don't have it.
Thank you. Could I ask you both, and there's only about a minute left, not even, do institutions need direction for fear that if you do the right thing and hold back research, your competitor in another province, another city might not? So we actually need standards from Ottawa to ensure we have fairness of the academic institutions and everyone's complying by them as well.
I would concur with that, as long as those standards are sophisticated, involve back and forth between the universities, are not just a diktat from a federal government to an autonomous institution. But the risk is not just for another city, another university. The risk is also another country. Most Western countries are deeply engaged, university to university, with China, with all the risks and advantages that conveys. What is needed is a sophisticated balance of risk and opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. We'll go on now to Ms. Zan for 5 minutes, please.
Oh, I believe it's...
I'm sorry, Ms. Yip, is it?
Yes, it is.
Pardon me, my mistake.
Thank you. And thank you to the witnesses for coming back to committee. This question is for Professor Evans. How do we build multilateral institutions in China? You had just referenced that. Will that help relations with China?
Well, getting China into multilateral institutions was a major part of Canadian policy from the time we recognized China and helped it get into the United Nations. We face a whole new challenge in working with Chinese on multilateralism now. We don't teach them how to play the game. They are designing the rules for the game. And that challenge of how we work with them on very difficult issues like sovereignty in disputed islands and the Arctic. Those are the kinds of matters where China, as a multilateral player with other countries, we may still on occasion have room to influence some of their thinking. I don't think it's preordained that China is on a path to overt supremacy in the world, but it does want to dominate. And where we see something important, we must not only work with the Chinese bilaterally, but let's cooperate with our Australian, our Singaporean, and other friends in trying to have those discussions that are so difficult and that the United States often cannot have because of its overt confrontation.
Where is there room to influence or make changes, or maybe even to prevent certain actions from China?
Well, as an academic, I have a lot of difficulty finding ways to influence or have impact even in my own country, in Ottawa, with the people at this table. But if we look at it from the perspective of Chinese short-term and long-term advantages, if we see it through their eyes, what they want out of peacekeeping, some of it we don't like, but some of what they want to do in peacekeeping, we can encourage. So that's the thing universities can provide in a way that government to government can't. We can spend 5 years talking with the Chinese group about what they want from the Arctic. And in that, does it add up to influence? Maybe, hard to predict, but it's the inevitable path we must try.
Thank you. Professor Holden, it was mentioned that there are 140,000 international students from China here in Canada. Should we continue to open our doors to Chinese international students? Often the cultural exchange is invaluable. They do boost our economy. Or should we be wary of any political influence they may bring, or any concerns about intellectual property being taken?
Well, those are such a good question. I actually think the number is closer to 200,000. PRC embassy uses 170 plus thousand. I think that's closer to the truth. But very quickly, students, we don't know yet the effect, but 1 million Chinese students abroad at any given time, roughly. We don't know what the long-term effects of that will be. It took one Chinese person, Sun Yat-sen, to help bring down the Qing dynasty. We don't know the effect of millions of Chinese who travel abroad and who come to this country, what that effect will be. About a third of them stay here, about 2/3 go back. Buried within that are ideas that they've been exposed to. Young people are rather receptive to new ideas. On balance, I say it's a good thing. We don't want, however, our universities to be completely dependent on Chinese funding. That's a given. That's a given. But on balance, that openness, and I believe, protect intellectual property and protect our national security by perhaps controlling the programs in which some students are allowed to participate, perhaps only open to Canadian nationals or to certain nationalities. But the idea of closing the door, I think, would actually, in the long run, serve to strengthen the hold of the Communist Party of China on its people. I think that exposure is a good thing.
On the flip side, what can we do to insulate Chinese international students in Canada from pressure coming from their own consulate or embassy? Witnesses have said in the past that international student activities are heavily monitored for dissent.
I think, well, one of my recommendations was a web portal run perhaps by one of our security agencies where any student, any professor who felt that there was undue influence upon them by a foreign government or by an individual could approach that, because they're often rather shy at reporting these things, particularly in the case of Chinese culture. But there needs to be a way that they can reach out, and this can be pushed back. CSIS is a key player in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Yip. Et maintenant, Monsieur Bergeron, pendant 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Bergeron. Mr. Evans, when you appeared before this committee in February 2020, you declared, and I quote, "The crisis will allow us to either greatly improve our relationship with China or greatly damage it." A year has gone by. How is the Canada-Chinese relation now?
I wish I could give you a positive answer. I would say that some of us have hoped that once we get the 3 M's problem solved, difficult as that might be in the time frame, that we can revert, go back to where we were, and that the storm will subside. I've come to the view that we are now in the context not just of a storm with China, but that we have entered a new season. Many of the behaviors, the strengths, the tensions that we face with China are going to be with us for matters of years. On my worst days, I think that not only have we entered a new season that is going to be colder and last for a while, but that we may see evidence of climate change. If the US-China relationship deteriorates further, if that Cold War comes, we are into an entirely new game. Now, that's well beyond the 3 M's problem, but we certainly have entered a new period, and we have to scale our expectations accordingly.
Diriez-vous?
Would you say that the West has lost the battle diplomatically? China has increased its influence, particularly in countries in development, under development in Africa and Asia?
Yeah, unquestionably. But it's not perfectly received. China is not seen as the great benefactor of the world, but they're seen as pretty useful. It doesn't mean China is going to dominate, but it does mean that China is going to play a much bigger role. The balance of forces is changing, and China and other non-Western countries are much more important in this multipolar world than we could have imagined even 4 or 5 years ago.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
And now Mr. Harris for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I was first of all wanted to say that part of the concerns that have been raised in academia, CSIS, for example, and some U.S. agencies have warned that that Chinese companies and academics are being compelled by their government to share work that they've carried out with Western researchers, with the China's military and the security and the industrial apparatus. So that seems to be an area of potential conflict, and that has to be resolved. Would that be one of the things that you need to understand more as academics before you can accept the fact that there might be some changes? And the second question, which is more tantalizing, Chinese diplomats tell us as individuals that there are things that China and Canada can cooperate and work on together, such as the issue of fighting climate change. Is that an area where we could, in fact, try to do something positive with China once we resolve the issue of the two Michaels who need to be repatriated as quickly as possible?
Can I tackle the second question just very briefly, Paul? First of all, I would say that there are, for example, climate change. There is no solution to climate change without China. They're far and away the largest producer of greenhouse gases. Their effects of mercury landing in our north coming from Chinese coal generation, electricity generating plants, that's unstoppable without Chinese collaboration and cooperation. However, we cannot do that on our own, but perhaps with our American and other allies, we can reach a consensus internationally with China to reduce those threats. I would argue, despite the rocky record of COVID-19 originating in China and with this failed vaccine, the reality is that 70% of the medical supplies needed to fight COVID in Canada in March and April of last year were arriving from China. And still 40% of our medical supplies necessary to fight COVID are coming from China. So in medical terms, that vast number of doctors is going to be a benefit. My son's hand operates because of Chinese microsurgery techniques. So medicine should know no boundaries, and we need to be open to those collaborations. Picking carefully, I would say, climate change, environment, health, and perhaps some dimensions of culture. That would be the safe areas where there's good prospects for collaboration once we get beyond the 3 M's.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Colleagues, I'm going to propose that we end this panel here. I hope Mr. Chong got the answer to the question that he had.
No, I didn't actually. So I'd like there's still 3 minutes left as far as I see.
Okay, we'll divide it a minute and a half, Mr. Chong.
Well, can I not get my...
a 5 minute? I do want to take a 5 minute break, but I'll give you a minute and a half. And then
can I have a bit more than a minute and a half, possibly? We do have 3 minutes left.
I'll give you 2. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to build on what some of my colleagues have raised earlier about anti-Asian racism. My father was a Chinese immigrant who came to this country in 1952, only a few short years after the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed by the Canadian Parliament. And even though the act was repealed, the sentiment behind it clearly had not been. And growing up as a half Chinese kid in the 1970s, I know full well what discrimination and racism is all about. But I want to ensure that something else is put on the record that I've seen firsthand. Many Canadians of Chinese descent who have been critical of China, such as Hong Kong pro-democracy activists and human rights groups, have been attacked and intimidated online and in person by their fellow Canadians of Chinese descent for not being sufficiently loyal to China and for not supporting the motherland. So I just wanted to make sure that that was on the record, because that community is a minority in many respects within a minority, and often they feel very isolated, and I think we need to give voice to those voiceless. But just a very quick question, seeing my time is limited, to Professor Holden. You'd mentioned in the industry committee that much of China's FDI investment arrives via third countries. Could you maybe elaborate on that a bit more?
Absolutely. And the House of Commons Library subscribes to the investment tracker produced by the China Institute at the University of Alberta, which can provide you with a lot of detail. But put quickly, that money flows through Hong Kong, it flows through Luxembourg, it flows through all of the Caribbean ports where there's such money is transferred. Now, it's not just China that does that. A lot of multinational corporations do the same thing for a reason, but it leads to incredible distortion in the numbers, so that if you look at Stats Canada numbers, the reporting of the volume of Chinese investment in this country is about a third to half of what it is in fact. And we can back that up, we at the China Institute, with facts that prove the numbers to be substantively higher.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chong, we'd enjoy inviting you to the University of British Columbia. We are plotting what we are going to do to try to diminish some of those intra-Chinese hostilities among our students when people resume in September.
Listen,
thank you. Thank you, Professor Evans.
I'm glad we took the time for that, Mr. Chong. Thank you. Ms. Zan, 2 minutes.
My goodness, I thought we were taking a break. Okay, so my question is for Professor Evans. You know, I've heard it said that words are windows or they're walls. And you had said earlier to committee last year, you asked a question, do we keep our doors open to Chinese students and to research exchanges in our universities while closing windows to protect intellectual property and national security in an era of technological competition with China and extraterritorial pressure from the United States? So could you please give us a response now to that question you posed last year? Thank you.
This is strange to say, but I think I got the right question and the right answer a year and a half ago. And what that means is that, I mean, as we're looking at how we're going to put those fences around certain kinds of Chinese activities, et cetera, the challenge is that our American friends are demanding regularly that we expand those areas into biomedical work. They're demanding that it is not just dual use military activity, but that in fact, those Chinese projects that we need to be censoring are not just about military dual use, but giving China certain commercial advantages in high-tech sectors. The attack on Huawei is a lot bigger than national security conventionally defined. It now comes into a peer competitor Chinese organization. And that's one of the places where I think Canada and the United States are going to have to differ if we move forward, and we need that professional discussion. Techno-nationalism is eating us up.
Thank you so much to our witnesses, professors. Much appreciated. It's been an excellent session. And now I'm going to suspend. We're going to take a 5-minute health break, but if we can get back in less than 5 minutes, let's try to do that, please. So we'll see you shortly, colleagues. Thank you. Director, National Capital Confucius Institute for Culture, Language, and Business, Carleton University, and Ward Alcock. Thank you both for being here. I will now turn to Mr. Lee for his opening remarks. Please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening. I would like to thank the chair of this special committee, distinguished vice chairs and member of this committee, members of parliament, for your kind invitation. I would also like to acknowledge support and guidance of the clerk and her colleagues. I appreciate the information they provided for this process in order to prepare for our discussion. My name is Justin Lee. I'm the director of the Confucius Institute at Carleton University. I'm a Canadian citizen. I came to Canada as a landed immigrant in 1996, and I received my Canadian citizenship from then Governor General of Canada, the Right Honorable Michael Jean, on July 1st, 2009. I was employed by an Ottawa-based high-tech company called Jetform as the country manager to launch its operation in China in 1998. After Jetform was bought by Adobe in 2002, I became an independent consultant engaging in international marketing for Canadian firms seeking business in China. And I applied to become the director of Confucius Institute at Carleton in early 2011. The process included a round of interviews with the faculty members from various departments, including business, public affairs, language, and arts. Our goal is to promote understanding, shared knowledge, and strengthen the human bonds between the people of Canada and people of China. And I'm honored to have the privilege of contributing to this effort. Our institute focuses on 3 areas. We support the delivery of Chinese language training. We offer some cultural programming, and we assist visiting scholars from China. Simply put, I connect Carleton with the Confucius Institute network of Chinese language instructors from China. The Chinese academics who are interested in coming to Canada as visiting scholars for the purpose of providing languages instructions initially contact our institute either individually or through their own universities. When Carleton requires instructors, I offer a selection of candidates to the university. These individuals are interviewed and selected through the normal Carleton process. Successful candidates must go through Canada's immigration process, which include both health and security check. Our cultural programming is another area of focus. These has included workshops on traditional arts, including calligraphy, paper cutting, food, and Tai Chi. Most of these activities are hands-on sessions for students at Carleton, providing experiential learning and immersive experiences. We've also offered music bands, and some are innovative. For example, we collaborated on an event where music students and alumni of Carleton performed their own fusion music works, jazz on traditional Chinese music instruments. On another occasion, our music students were invited to the National Arts Center in Ottawa to perform an open concert for public education purposes. Since 2013, we have organized study tours in China. The students are responsible for covering the cost of transportation to and from China. The Institute acts as a host once they arrive in China. Each tour is accompanied by a Carleton faculty or staff member as the chaperone supervisor. The student selection is managed by the relevant Carleton departments and faculty members. We always inform the Canadian Embassy in Beijing of our China tours. In 2017, our music student group was invited to the embassy when the former Governor General, the Right Honorable David Johnson, visited China. It was a major highlight for our students. Finally, I assisted our visiting scholars while they are in Canada. This is an informal role that includes helping them access health services, find the grocery store when they first arrive, and generally welcoming them to Canada. But to be clear, the Institute at Carleton University is not involved in any elementary or high school programs. We focus solely on delivering Chinese language instruction to the students at Carleton, as well as adult audiences for professional development purposes at their own points of interest. I hope this offers a clear sense of our activity at Carleton. In closing, I would like to state that I'm proud of our work at Carleton Confucius Institute, and I feel privileged to contribute to shared understanding, closer relationship It's the country of my birth and the country where I have chosen to live and raise my family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. And now, Mr. Alcock, good to see you again. Please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I've not put in any written remarks, but I did want to make a few comments before the session begins. First, let me say it's a pleasure to appear before the committee. Some of my views are public on issues such as Huawei and the Meng case and the detention of the two Michaels. So I won't spend a lot of time dealing with those issues, but happy to answer questions with respect to any of those issues or my views with respect to any of those issues. On the broader issue with respect to China, I thought two things I think in the last week or two are important. One, the meeting between the Americans and the Chinese on climate change, and the comments today by the American Secretary of State in London, in which he essentially said that the goal of the United States was not the containment of China, but rather that the competition with China, that the relationship with China needed to be conducted in an appropriate way, in accordance with the multilateral system that we and the Americans in particular have spent many years trying to building since the Second World War. I thought both of those events were important, and they suggest that there is perhaps a better way forward than under the previous American administration, but obviously that will take some time to develop. My background, Mr. Chairman, is largely on the intelligence side, and indeed I spent over 25 years in intelligence. And I did want to make a couple of points with respect to that area. First, let me say that it isn't. There is more than one country that collects intelligence in Canada. China is by no means the only one that does so. It is, however, probably our largest counterintelligence target, and that would have been true back as far as the late 1990s. So that isn't really a change. And the methods that China uses have not really changed either. There are some new tools, cyber tools that were not as advanced in the late 1990s, but those are really, in many respects, only tools that allow agencies to do things that they did through other means in an earlier time. The Chinese have over the years exercised a wide range of intelligence collection capabilities, ranging from what we used to call vacuum cleaner collection, which was everybody collecting all the time. So any visiting delegation would spend some of its time appearing in places where they were not supposed to be to take photographs or collect other information. But they also have very professional organizations which are dedicated to collecting intelligence in the normal ways that intelligence agencies, both in the West and in other parts of the world, collect information. The Chinese also spend a great deal of time in developing those who they see as supporting their interests. Not all countries are so heavily engaged in that exercise as the Chinese, but certainly over the years, that is something that Chinese have emphasized in terms of developing the relationships that they see as possibly advancing the interests of China in dealing with a country like Canada or other countries. Finally, let me say that I think there is a tendency, or at least I have observed a tendency, because so little happens in the counterintelligence world, or so apparently so little happens in the counterintelligence world. There is a tendency to believe that nothing is happening, Speaking as an intelligence professional, I guess I would make the comment, which I hope is useful to the members of the committee, and that is that the fact that you're not seeing anything doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Counterintelligence is not like counterterrorism, where the goal is to arrest somebody, to arrest a terrorist, and either expel them from Canada or imprison them. Counterintelligence is a much more long-term, much slower investigation in which prosecution is not necessarily the aim of the game at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Alcock. Sorry to cut you off, but we're over the 5-minute point.
Okay.
And now we'll go to our first round of questions. We have Mr. Jennis for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lee, what kind of information about your ongoing operations do you provide to entities in China?
Pardon, well, could you repeat your question?
What kind of information about your operations do you provide to entities in China?
This institute is a part of Carleton. It's like many other institute and center. So one of many in Carleton. So it is under Carleton's policy and procedures. So the other centers and the institute, like they focus on different parts of the world, like the Indian Center, and this institute focus only on language training.
Sorry, Mr. Lee, if my question wasn't clear, but let me ask it again. What kind of information about your ongoing operations do you provide to entities in China? Are you reporting back?
We don't report anything to China. I report only to Canada, to Carleton University.
You provide no information on your operations, on numbers, on programming?
We don't report. I'm an employee of Carleton. I don't report to anyone else except Carleton.
Thank you, sir. And I just want to identify as well that this committee does have the power to send for documents, and that's something we may choose to do following testimony this evening. Mr. Lee, in the interest of promoting understanding, would you recommend that Carleton University invite the Dalai Lama to come to campus? And if the Dalai Lama were to visit Carleton University and you were invited to attend a reception welcoming him, would you choose to attend?
I'm not in a position to answer this question. I don't take any kind of assumption.
Pardon me?
So I am not in a position to answer this question. I don't have the knowledge, and I cannot take a question on a kind of assumption.
I'm not sure what kind of knowledge you're talking about here. You're unfamiliar with the Dalai Lama, or I mean, if the university was considering inviting this fairly well-known person, you mentioned the center's mandate is to promote understanding and exchanges and dialogue. What would your recommendation be with respect to an invitation like that?
I would make my decision when the time comes, and I cannot make a decision right now.
Okay. Do you believe that the government of China is failing to adhere to its international human rights obligations? And how are human rights abuses by the government of China discussed in the context of curricular materials or events hosted by the Confucius Institute at Carleton?
I'm not aware of any such allegation in the institute at Carleton University.
You're not aware that human rights...
Any kind of allegation in the institute at Carleton University.
Okay, I'm not talking about allegations against the institute, though. I'm asking if there is discussion about Chinese government human rights abuses that takes place in the Confucius Institute.
Well, I heard from news and read from news, but I haven't heard anything here at Carleton in this institute.
Okay, so as far as you know, there are not discussions taking place about human rights abuses in China at the Confucius Institute?
Not that I'm aware at this institute at Carleton University.
Okay. Where do you get your funding from? Various experts have said that you are funded by the CCP Propaganda Department affiliated with United Front and Works Department. Where does the funding that you get from China source from?
It is from the Confucius Institute head office. It's Confucius Institute in Beijing. That fund goes to the university finance account and managed complete under the university finance.
So you receive funding from the Confucius Institute head office in Beijing, but you're telling me that at the same time you don't provide any information back to them on how those funds are used?
Well, at the time they kind of asked how the fund is managed. And I told them it's managed by University Finance, then there's no more questions.
Who develops the curricular materials that you use? Are they developed by head office or are they developed by you locally?
Okay, well, let me answer this question. So we have visiting scholars from China. So they apply for they express their willingness to be visiting scholars. So I collect their the application, identify as a candidates. When the Carleton requires the instructors, I give this candidate to our Carleton, the departments. So the department review their qualification, academic qualifications, and arrange interviews. So when the department of faculty
sorry, Mr. Lee, the question is about curricular materials, not about visiting scholars.
Yeah, so it's because we have the visiting scholars from China and teaching the courses at Carleton at the School of Linguistic and Language Studies. It is the course of the linguistic language studies, and that they follow the Carleton policy of curriculum, Carleton content.
Okay, thank you, sir. One last question. Have you ever had visiting scholars visit from Taiwan? And do you consider Taiwan to be part of China for the purposes of your objectives of building connection and understanding?
We have not received, and from the Institute point part.
Thank you, Mr. Jenis. We'll now go on to Ms. Yip for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you for coming as witnesses during this late hour. My first question is to Ward, Mr. Elcock, pardon me. I noticed in your bio that you were the federal coordinator for the Olympics. And I'm just wondering how you feel about Canadian athletes participating in the upcoming Beijing Olympics.
Mr. Chairman, my view on the subject, frankly, is that the last time that as a country we decided not to participate in the Olympics, which was the boycott of the Olympics in the Soviet Union, was really not a success. It did nothing to further the point, and was frankly not a success. I think that should not be taken as a comment with respect to any of the concerns that are expressed about China and China's practices. But I'm not sure that the Olympics are necessarily the best venue for that, for those matters to be discussed. And I frankly don't think that a boycott of the Beijing Olympics will achieve anything.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, from 2007 to 2012, there were 15 Confucius Institutes opened across Canada. What led to their rapid enhancement at the time, and has there been any similar increases since then?
The Confucius Institute at Carleton started in operation in 2012, and I cannot speak for the other institute, really.
Yet in October 2014, the Toronto District School Board had removed CI Confucius Institute's involvement and its contributions to the public school curriculum due to not aligning with community values. Why did this happen? Is CI present in any schools now?
I cannot speak for that institute of what's happening in Toronto. And our curriculum is the Carleton curriculum, the visiting scholar teaching Carleton curriculum content.
are your instructors free to discuss human rights? Is there open transparency at Carleton University?
So the visiting scholars follow and are covered under all the Carleton policies and the procedures, just like any other scholars at Carleton. We're just guided by the academic freedom and the human rights of freedom of expression.
Thank you. Mr. Elcock, back in December, you appeared before committee to discuss what you saw as a relatively minor procurement of NUCTEC. But I want to focus on remarks that you said previously that we should not be looking at one company when it comes to investments, but the Chinese government as a whole. Before committee, you discussed enhancement to security reviews, declaring that you might continue to want to buy from China if you've taken all of the security issues into review. Earlier this year, we issued revised guidelines on the national security review of investments to ensure that Canadian businesses must consider what national security review provisions mean for their business planning and supply chains, especially from investments by state-owned or state-influenced investors. What are the benefits to this approach, and what else can be done?
I think, Mr. Chairman, the approach to reviewing businesses is likely to be an ongoing process. The reality is, I think it has moved substantially from the first cases that really became an issue with respect to the Chinese acquisition of businesses in Canada. I think it really does require a fairly careful analysis in each case. What are the benefits? What are the costs? What are the risks to any particular acquisition? And frankly, in some respects, it is difficult to write hard and fast rules. It really does require a review of each case against all of the issues, such as risk, cost, benefits, etc.
Mr. Lee, you have given lots of lectures, and in order to understand China, that history must be more than a background, but the framework for analyzing the present. The impact of culture and traditions is sometimes ignored, and it's not unusual for outsiders to look at China from the perspective of their own societies. Can you expand on this?
Thank you. We arrange some cultural programming mainly just for experiential learning and immersive experiences like workshops on the hands-on sessions on the traditional arts.
Mr. Lee, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but the 6 minutes has concluded for Ms. Yip, and I'm sorry I have to interrupt your answer. Perhaps you'll have another chance to answer the question from someone else, but we have to go on now and continue on.
Let's continue with Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes. Mr. Elcock, if you had been called upon to advise the Canadian government in 1936 when they had the chance to take part in the Munich Olympics, would you have advised the Canadian government to boycott them?
That's a rather different issue. The Nazi Party is not quite the Communist Party of China. The situation is not entirely comparable. It is much closer to the situation with respect to the boycotting of the Olympics in the Soviet Union. I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, it makes sense to make the Olympics the vehicle for objecting to issues with respect to difficulties between ourselves and China. There is no question that the relationship between China and Canada at this point is extremely difficult, but I'm not sure it's advanced on one side or the other by not participating in the Beijing Olympics.
Merci. En 2000.
Thank you. 21 years ago, you testified before the Parliamentary Committee on Immigration. You said at the time that applications was still processed manually. Applications for visas, rather. You said that a computerized system would speed things up, but using a computer network would raise security questions. Things have evolved, as you know. We have now entrusted VFS Global with the task of processing and managing visa applications placed in China. Now, Chinese capital upstream is involved in this outfit, and downstream it is a Beijing security outfit who's involved. What do you have to say with regard to the fact that no background checks were made about this institution by the security agency? This agency, or rather this outfit, processes confidential information. Do you think things are safer now than in 2000?
Mr. Chairman, I have seen the comments in the press by some who are responsible, who have indicated that they are taking appropriate measures to ensure that that no information is available from the systems in Beijing. I frankly am not sure that I would find that those positions credible. The reality is that that institution or that office functions entirely within the control of the Chinese intelligence services. For an intelligence service, that is frankly potentially gold. And the reality is there is almost always a way to access material, no matter what security is put in place in a situation like that. So frankly, I am not convinced by the arguments that the processing of information in the facility in Beijing is secure.
Considering that this business has already leaked information in another country, we are concerned about the fact that when we asked the Canadian Security Agency what background checks it made, we received absolutely no answer. No checks had been made before the contract was awarded. In fact, the contract was renewed at least one time. Should we not be extremely preoccupied or concerned about the fact that the data from people applying for visas to Canada could possibly be communicated to Chinese authorities?
Mr. Chairman, it would seem to me that is an important concern. Although, to be frank, the reality is any communication by anyone in China to even to a Canadian embassy or a Canadian facility would probably come to the attention of the Chinese, no matter what security you put in place. The reality is that in this case, it does not seem that the protections to ensure the security of information are frankly credible.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
And now, Mr. Harris, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Mr. Lee, is your position at Carleton, is that an academic position or an administrative position as the head of the Confucius Institute?
Thank you, sir. It's the administrative. It's not academic one.
So you look after the administration of the Institute.
Yes.
Now, we had a witness before this committee on the 19th of April, who's by the name of Carolyn Bartholomew, and she's the chair of the United States China Economic and Security Review Commission. And she offered the opinion that the Confucius Institutes serve as a, quote, platform for espionage, a tool for the Chinese Communist Party to control Chinese students on university campuses, and a means to, quote, spread the Chinese worldview. Have you heard of this type of criticism or comments in relation to Confucius Institutes? Now, she's talking about the United States, I presume, but have you heard of this before?
I read a similar one. I don't recall this is a specific one, but I cannot speak.
So is your activities involved being a platform for espionage in Canada? And you through your institute, are the students controlled by the CCP?
No, absolutely not.
You don't do anything like that?
No.
So, but so you're completely. This is all totally. This has no bearing and no relationship to anything you do on your campus.
No.
Tell me now, this visiting scholars that you come. You say that you present their resumes and applications to the university. Are you aware as to whether or not the visiting scholars who come are they pre-selected or pre-screened within China before they are able to apply?
So what I do is when these Chinese academics and who would like to come to Canada as a visiting scholar to teach Chinese, so they contact our institute or they contact their own universities. So then I will find the candidate then through the Confucius network of the Chinese language instructors. So then I will report to the department and the faculties. So if they need an instructor, so then
they'd be pre-approved by the Confucius Institute community of scholars before they apply.
That we don't know. You have to ask those at their institutes and what they do there. But Carleton will review their academic qualifications.
Oh yes, I understand that. You said that before, but you say they come from the Confucius Institute community of scholars before they come to Carleton.
I cannot speak for their institution.
Oh, I see. Well, but I mean the Confucius community of scholars within China who are offered to come here. Is that right?
No, sometimes the individuals they contact us. Sometimes they told their their universities. Then we contact the universities, and then also we contact an individual.
Okay,
but what we don't know what they have.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I only have a few more minutes. I do have a question for Mr. Ward Alcock. Mr. Bergeron suggested you testified in 2000 before the House of Commons that you didn't have any trust in computers in those days because you'd rather have paper because you were concerned that there was security concerns. I would suspect that you probably think there are more security concerns now than before. Do you believe there's sufficient ability to mitigate those concerns in dealing with international communications between here and China, or whether they go through networks such as those controlled by Huawei?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not quite sure which communications you're referring to, but if you're referring to the information at the facility in Beijing that processes visas, I think the issue there is on the ground in China.
Oh yeah, no, I get that, but I want your understanding of how communications have advanced by 20 years since then. Are you any more comfortable with the ability to mitigate communication by computers over long distances, such as between here and China or anywhere in the world?
Yes, it is possible. Encryption and other things advance at the same, and computers have advanced in the same time period. So it is possible, but whether or not, to take the Huawei case for example, one would want to build one system with Huawei equipment, that might be a more difficult question, because then the issue becomes, is the equipment trapped or backdoored?
And then we hear stories about the Americans selling encryption services through a back door to the German company and reading everybody's diplomatic exchanges for 15 or 16 years. So it's not something that's unheard of to be able to interfere with this equipment, is it?
No, it's not, Mr. Chairman, and it is not unusual for other countries to collect intelligence. China is not the only country in the world that collects intelligence, so does Canada.
So we collect intelligence internationally as well through your agency or your former agency?
The service does operate outside of Canada, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Maintenant, on continue avec le deuxième tour.
We'll begin the second round of questions. Mr. Paulus, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Mr. Lee. In 2013, CSIS published a report that said the Confucius Institutes were a Trojan horse that allowed China to perform espionage. Is this still the case?
Speak to the view of others. I heard that report and I read the news, but certainly it's not the case with Carlton.
Okay, merci.
Thank you. Mr. Elcock, we just spoke about Huawei. In 2017, you and many others warned Canada about Huawei and 5G. 4 years later, no decision has been made by the Canadian government, which is still waiting on reports. What do you think of all that?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I would prefer to see a decision taken, but I'd also prefer to see Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig back in Canada, and I suspect that that's not going to happen for a while either. I'm not sure that I find the failure that not taking a decision, that the fact that the government has not yet taken a decision as enormously troubling at this point in time, given all of the other issues extant. But I assume at some point a decision will be taken.
But you believe that the decision has been made with regard to the agencies, that this is simply political because of the two Michaels, and that if there were not the question of the two Michaels, the decision would have already been made?
I think, Mr. Chairman, it is very hard for me to conceive of a situation in which the government of Canada would decide to proceed with allowing Huawei to operate in Canada, given all of the circumstances. I frankly don't think that that is likely to happen. Does that mean a decision has been taken? I obviously don't know the answer to that question. But it may well be that the government has taken a decision but has decided not to announce it yet.
Okay.
Generally speaking, do you think that the government of Canada lacks leadership on the China file at every level?
I think that's not entirely clear, Mr. Chairman. I think the challenges for Canada in dealing with China, particularly with the previous American administration, were a huge challenge. And that challenge was only made worse by the issues around Huawei and then by the Chinese taking hostages, Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig. That plus the main case have all made the situation with China extremely difficult. I think, as I said at the beginning of this, the reality is the position of the current American administration, I think, is much more supportive to a Canadian position, and we'll see where we go with the Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig, and whether the Chinese decide at some point to release them.
But overall, when we're talking about the Chinese influence on Canadian operations, Chinese influence in northern Canada, do you believe that Canada's leadership is strong enough, or should it go further by working with NATO partners, for example, or by forming a coalition? Obviously, our American partners are help relation-wise. But do you think we should have a much stronger position as Canadians to protect ourselves with our partners?
I think, Mr. Chairman, it's easier to have a strong position when we have the partnerships. When we are completely exposed, the challenges are considerably greater. I think what I was trying to say a second ago was that given the current American position, it is beginning to become clear that there is an opening to a partnership with the United States and possibly with other NATO partners and other partners around the world that will take us in the direction we would like to go, or many would like to go. And then it will become clearer what the position of the government is. But at the moment, I would give them. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Paulus. Maintenant, on continue avec Monsieur Dubourg pendant 5 minutes.
Monsieur Dubourg, go ahead, please. Thank you, Chair. Good evening to our witnesses, Mr. Elcock and Mr. Lee. I'll start with Mr. Lee. We're happy to have you with us at the committee tonight. You're saying that since 2011, you have been the director of the Confucius Institute here. We'd like to understand a bit more about the Institute. You did mention the 3 roles of the Institute with regard to language, culture, and guidance services, but you no doubt know that many witnesses have come to tell us of foreign interference, of threats as well. Questions have already been asked of you about this, and a witness who was there just before you, I don't know if you heard him, Mr. Paul Evans, I'll try to paraphrase what he said. He talked about a Chinese propaganda machine, speaking of the Confucius Institutes. I'd like to know, how do you defend yourself personally when you hear all these comments about your institute?
Thank you, sir. I haven't read the news and media of such stories, but at Carleton, this Confucius Institute at Carleton, it follows strictly the policy and procedures of the Carleton University. And all the visiting scholars coming to the Institute also covered under the same policies and procedures. So they teach the Carleton curriculum content. Everything is under the Carleton policy and procedures. Thank you, sir.
Merci.
Thank you for your answer, Mr. Lee. I'm here in Montreal. In Montreal, we do have a Confucius Institute. It's open to students and to the general public, the students of the university and to the general public. Do you agree with that statement?
I cannot really speak for the other institute, but at Carleton, the Confucius Institute provides support to the School of Linguistic Language Study, which offers the credit course to the registered student at Carleton University.
Okay.
I see. Thank you. Perhaps a last question. I don't have much time. Mr. Lee, you welcome students or teachers rather, from China, and I'm talking only about your Carleton Institute. We know that these people are prepared before they arrive here in Canada. What I'd like to know is whether you at the Carleton Confucius Institute, well, in the media, it says that any practitioners of Falun Gong are not authorized to work at the Confucius Institutes. Is that true?
The Institute, thank you, sir. Can you hear me? So we receive the visiting scholars from China, and their academic qualifications are reviewed by our faculty member in the departments. Once accepted academically, then we'll issue invitation, and there's a very complete internal process. The Confucius Institute at Carleton initialized internal process. Then the process includes approval of the chair and director of the department, then the dean of the faculty, then ultimately the vice president of the Research International or the provost of academic.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. But very quickly, can anyone register at the Confucius Institute, that is including Falun Gong practitioners at the Carleton Confucius Institute I'm talking about?
So the credit course run by the School of Linguistic and the Language Studies is open to everyone.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Dubourg.
Merci.
Et maintenant, Monsieur Bergeron, pendant...
Mr. Bergeron, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to follow up on Mr. Paulu's questions about Huawei. Mr. Elcock, why is it that the Government of Canada, apart from the current Two Michaels situation, why is it that the government has not announced their decision, whereas the other countries in the Five Eyes group have already determined that Huawei will be excluded from developing 5G on their territory?
Mr. Chairman, I can't answer that question. I don't sit in government councils anymore, so I don't know precisely why the government has not taken action. But it is certainly conceivable, and I suspect that it would have an impact, the detention of the two Michaels in China and the potential consequences of a decision on Huawei that decision might have on their detention.
Mais selon vous, la décision...
But in your opinion, the decision has already been made, and the answer is no?
In my view, I would be very surprised if the decision were to. I would be extremely surprised if the decision were to be yes. In other words, I think the decision is a no.
OK. Et qu'est-ce qui rend les autres entreprises du 5G plus...
And why are other 5G businesses more reliable, given that some of them rely on the People's Republic of China to deliver their technology?
Mr. Chairman, it is not simply the issue of 5G and Huawei is not simply an issue of Huawei. The reality of the new 5G system is that it is potentially attackable by a wide variety of intelligence agencies and others around the world. So if Huawei is not part of the system, it does not mean that there is no potential for an attack on your 5G system. That goes without saying. Whatever system is put in place, whoever it is managed by, it will require care, it will require inspection, it will require certainty as to the suppliers. The issue with Huawei is simply the question of you have a company which is a Chinese company. While it's not directly controlled by the Chinese state, it is a company within the control of the Chinese state.
Thank you. Sorry. Merci, Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Mr. Harris, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Elok, you have a background as a lawyer, and I'm told by biographical notes that you worked as also in the Privy Council office, special advisor to the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources. We know that China is very interested in resources in Canada, particularly rare minerals and other specialty activities. Do you see that as a potential issue? And is the Canada-China foreign, I think it's called the Canada-China Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, does that prevent a barrier for us having some say over what the nature of the Chinese activity in Canada might be for minerals that are very desirable, but perhaps in very short supply?
No, my understanding of the law is that it would not prevent Canada from preventing such an acquisition from being made. And obviously the issue of the nature of the mineral product, if it was rare earths, for example, it would be obviously a much more concern than if it were, say, something like more innocuous like tin or whatever. So obviously all of those issues are important in looking at any acquisition by the Chinese and any takeover by the Chinese. But in the event that there were to be such a takeover or an acquisition, the government could take action if it believed that it was a national security risk.
But I just saw a opinion piece a couple of days ago talking about the future of relationship with China, and there's an argument being made that the EU should abandon ratification of its comprehensive agreement on investment with China to help forge a different approach in terms of what kinds of investment and support for Chinese enterprise should be permitted as we move forward. Do you have any views on what kind of investment relations Canada should have with China and vice versa?
I think that is something, frankly, Mr. Chairman, we should proceed very carefully on. The reality is there are risks to some acquisitions, some takeovers, not necessarily all of them. For example, have...
Sorry, but I have to conclude.
No, not a problem.
But I want to thank the witnesses very much. We appreciate very much your appearance this evening and your testimony. And that concludes.
Mr. Chair, could we not take some additional time? We have
we have like about 30 seconds before the time scheduled for the meeting is over. If it's the will of members to continue, I don't know how long we have interpreters for. I don't think we have them for very long.
If we extend for 8 minutes and give each party equal time, we did start late. So
let me see if there's agreement to do this. Is there agreement to extend for, as Mr. Jennis is asking, for 8 minutes? I don't. And by the way, in terms of starting late, if members, I was on at 6:15 to do my sound check. If members would all come before 6:30 to do that, it would be very helpful and appreciated. And we would start on time as we should. So I'm not going to be taking responsibility for the fact that if we didn't start at 6:30. The meeting is scheduled 6:30 to 9:30. Mr. Lightbound. Mr. Lightbound?
Pardon, Mr. President.
Excuse me, Chair. A point of order, please. I was out of the meeting for a few minutes, so perhaps this comes out of nowhere, but just a point of order. I'd like to correct a question asked by Mr. Paulus.
This sounds substantive, but if Mr. Lightbound will agree to my proposal for 2 minutes each, then he will have 2 minutes to do precisely what he seeks to do.
Sounds good. I was logged out, so I'll get back to it. Sorry, Mr.
So is there agreement then to have an additional 8? Is anyone opposed to an additional 8 minutes? I don't see anyone. Okay, 2 minutes each, you say?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Jennis, 2 minutes.
Mr. Lee, my colleagues have raised the fact that many witnesses have told us that Confucius Institutes are a front for espionage. You have told us that at least the Confucius Institute at Carleton is not, but you've also been unwilling to contradict the party line on any issue, such as in response to my questions about human rights abuses or the Dalai Lama. This makes me wonder if your employment status would be at risk if you criticize the Chinese government. So I want to put this to the test here. Mr. Lee, based on your bio, you were living in China during the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. The Chinese Red Cross estimates that over 2,500 students peacefully protesting were shot in cold blood. So as someone who today works with students at a university, do you believe that these figures are accurate? And do you think the Chinese state was wrong to sanction the opening of fire on peaceful protesters?
Thank you, sir. And I am the employee of Carleton University, and my employment is with Carleton, and I don't think it has anything to do with China.
Mr. Mr. Lee, would you like to respond to my question about the Tiananmen Square massacre?
Sorry, what's your question again?
In
I'm sorry.
1989, over 2,500 student protesters were massacred in cold blood. As someone who works with students, do you believe that those figures are accurate as reported by the Chinese Red Cross? And do you believe the Chinese state was wrong to sanction the opening of fire on peaceful protesters?
I don't have this expertise and knowledge to validate the number of that incident.
You were living in China at the time, Mr. Lee.
Yes.
Do you believe that it was wrong for the Chinese government to sanction the opening of fire on peaceful protesters in Tiananmen Square?
I was in China. I was in Beijing, and my friends and then none of my acquaintances have been that victim so far.
Thank you.
It's an unfortunate event.
Thank you, Mr. Jenis. Thank you, Monsieur Lightbound. 2 minutes.
Mr. Lightbound, you have 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Before asking my question, I would just like to correct something said by Mr. Paulus. He says that there's a report that would have been written by CSIS. However, it clearly says in the preamble of this report that CSIS is not the report, but rather independent researchers wrote the report. They were directed to do so by CSIS, but CSIS did not publish the report, write the report rather. Mr. Lee, I'll be following up on Mr. Dubourg's question. As director of the Confucius Institute at Carleton, would you agree to hire a Falun Gong practitioner?
Thank you, sir. I'm the only employee of the staff of the Confucius Institute at Carleton University, and we don't hire anyone else. I'm the only one, and we work with the visiting scholars from China. Then we teach at the School of Linguistic and Language Studies.
Okay, merci, Monsieur Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. That's it for me. Thank you, Chair. I have no other questions.
Monsieur Lightbound and Monsieur Ber.
Thank you, Mr. Lightbound. Mr. Bergeron, you have 2 minutes. I'd like to continue the line of questioning. I'd like to ask Mr. Lee if he's the only employee. Is he the only one to give courses? I understand that he hires professors to teach Mandarin.
Thank you, sir. And I don't hire, and Carleton does not hire the Chinese visiting scholars. Visiting scholars, they apply themselves, and the Carleton review their academic qualification. And these visiting scholars, they are responsible for their own funding coming to Canada.
Mais quel est le rôle?
But what is the Institute's role then? If the university hires the Mandarin professors itself?
So Carleton is free to hire like Canadian local instructors. The mandate of the Institute is to work with the business scholars from China. And we provide the selection of the candidate and for the department to review, interview, and select. And then they teach at these courses at the School of Linguistic and Language Courses, Language Studies.
Donc, tous les professeurs.
So all the professors come from the People's Republic of China?
It's only 1 or 2, and we have about 2 at a time or each semester, a year, that kind of range. But now we don't have anyone. They all return to China by the end of September, at the end of December last year.
Et qui fait la...
And who selects from the applicants proposed to Carleton?
Language department or faculty at Carleton University. Carleton has the right to decide or decline their application.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Bergeron. And now to Mr. Harris for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll go back to Mr. Alcock. perhaps you can have an opportunity now to elaborate on what you were saying. I hope you haven't lost your train of thought. We were talking about investment and the concerns in the future in terms of relations with China on that score. Would you care to carry on?
Mr. Chairman, I mean, the reality of China is a reality. It is a major economic power in the world. It is likely that Canada will have to deal with China on some level, just as the Americans have now indicated they will deal with China on climate change. We will likely have to deal with China on climate change and other issues. The reality is, if we are to be participant in the Chinese market, that at some level we will have to find accommodations.
Should we be selective from a strategic point of view?
I think we have to be very careful about how we. Yes, I think we should be selective. It is from a strategic point of view. But there are a lot of the reality of even Canada today is that a lot of canola farmers would like to sell their canola to China. A lot of pork farmers would like to sell their pork to China. So the issue of relationships with China already exists. It is something we will have to manage, but it is obviously something we should manage very, very carefully, given the nature of China, given its practices, which are not entirely accord with our view of multinational institutions in many ways. So I do think Canada has to exercise oversight over much of what we do with China and how we do it.
Thank you, sir. I think our time is up.
Yes, our time is up. Thank you very much, Mr. Lee and Mr. Elkoff. We appreciate your appearance this evening. Colleagues, thank you. The meeting is adjourned.